All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I thought maybe we'd just start off this morning by just everybody going ahead and introducing themselves briefly. The senator should be here shortly, and then we'll get going with the program.
I think that sounds perfect. We do have microphones here, so we can, as we introduce ourselves, we can pass these around. So I'm John Yarbrough with DWR, and I've been at DWR for 19 years now as a civil engineer, and so I will be working here with this group as the co-chair, helping us run these meetings.
Good morning, Joel Ledesma, CDWR. Been with the department quite a while, and I'm happy to be here.
Matt Mintink, four-time evacuee out of Yuba City, and in '86 flood, my father's mill was one of the ones inundated from storm damage, and been a community advocate for better flood control since.
Mikey Namina, Executive Director of the Cedar Butte Flood Control Agency.
Hello, my name is Runes Torsen. Wear a number of hats, but today I'm wearing the hat of researcher with UC Berkeley's Center for Catastrophic Risk Management expertise in civil works and infrastructure. I'm a licensed civil engineer and geotechnical engineer and a Class A, Class B contractor in the state of California. It's crazy.
Ron Stark, Friends of the River Conservation staff.
Dr. Sandy Linville, not an engineer.
Sean Early, General Manager of Richville Irrigation District.
Boy, Honey, Sheriff of Butte County.
Bill Conley, District 1 Supervisor, Butte County.
Larry Grunman, got here about 15 years ago and have been on ORAC ever since, background in power development and energy production with major utilities and energy companies.
Laura Page, here today for Congressman Doug LaMalfa.
Curtis Grima with Mr. Gallagher's office.
James Gallagher, Assemblyman, concerned citizen. All right. Do we want to do maybe some introductions maybe around here as well?
Dave Sarkisian, DWR. I'm managing the State Water Project Dam Safety Program and also participating in the CNA project.
I'm Eric C. I'm an Environmental Program Manager here at the Oroville Field Division for the Department of Water Resources. I'm the Chief of the FERC License Coordination Branch.
Speakers pass around microphone.
I'm Steve Varigan. I'm with GEI Consultants, and I'm working under contract to DWR on the Comprehensive Needs Assessment Program.
Dave Duvall with the Department of Water Resources, Chief of the Division of Operation and Maintenance.
Morning, everyone. I'm Ted Craddock. I'm with DWR as well. Last year I served as the project manager for the spillway repair effort and currently serving as executive manager for our overall Oroville recovery program.
Morning, my name is Sergio Escobar. I am the executive manager for the CNA project, and I've been with DWR for close to 29 years now.
I'm Mary Beth Day. I'm with Kearns and West, helping with meeting coordination.
Good morning, Eric Ponsley with Kearns and West as well. We're a meeting coordination team, and if folks haven't done it before you go, it'd be great to have everyone sign in the sign-in sheet at the front there.
Thank you. Lelio Mejia with Josente Consultants and a member of the IRB.
I'm Paul Schweiger, and I'm a member of the IRB board.
Betty Andrews. I'm a civil engineer, principal engineer with Environmental Science Associates and member of the IRB.
I'm Bruce Muller, retired from the Bureau of Reclamation and a member of the IRB.
Liza Whitmore, Public Information Officer, Department of Water Resources for the Oroville Dam.
Derek Bell, Lieutenant with Butte County Sheriff's Office.
Our last person is coming through the door as we speak.
Senator Nielsen arrives.
Okay, well, Senator Nielsen should be coming in here. We'll go ahead and get started with our program. We got, the agenda kind of in front of you. Senator?
Hey, folks. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Esteemed bunch. Am I worthy of sitting in this crowd?
Absolutely.
Hey, buddy.
So I think we'll go ahead and get started. We just did some introductions. Everybody kind of went around, introduced themselves briefly.
I think I know most everybody, so let's not do it again.
And so I think first we'll just kind of do a little introductory comments, and I think we're going to move into the second part here, the Ad Hoc Group meeting process. One, I just want to welcome everybody and thank everybody for being a part of this and taking time out of everybody has, I think, very busy schedules to make time for this. The comprehensive needs assessment, when I first heard that this was going to be conducted, I thought this is a very much needed, probably long overdue process that we needed to do at the Oroville facility. And, for me, when we first heard about it, we wanted to ensure that there was local input into this process. And so Senator Nielsen and I have been long pushing for a local ad hoc to have input and to be able to give feedback to people into this process. And so, for us, I want to thank Department of Water Resources, specifically Joel Ledesma, who we spent a lot of time over the last few months, and I think he heard that call, and I appreciate you helping to put this process together where we have this committee. I also want to thank each and every one of the members who have agreed to sit on this ad hoc committee. I think we've got a great team of folks here with a lot of different, diverse, various, and needed expertise in all of the issues that are going to come up. I just want to say a few words just about the purpose of this ad hoc. To me, I think number one, it's for all of us to better understand, and especially for those of us in the local area, for us to better understand the infrastructure at Oroville Dam, and how it works, and what are the issues and concerns and deficiencies in the existing infrastructure, and then secondly, to help define, what needs to be done to address deficiencies in the existing facility and the upgrades and repairs that are necessary to provide what I want to say is top-level public safety. We don't want to be middle of the road on dam safety. We want to be the best in dam safety. The tallest dam in the nation needs to be the best in terms of dam safety. In order to do this, we need to listen. And I want to really emphasize that point. We need to listen to each other. And so I think that should be a big part of our discussions, or that should be a big, not discussions, but a big part of our underlying principle of our ad hoc. For DWR, we want you to truly listen and hear the issues and concerns that we have with the existing infrastructure and operations. These are concerns that we've had for a long time, long before the 2017 incident. And I think you'll hear some of that here later today. For the ad hoc board members, we need to listen very carefully and intently to the IRB and to DWR to understand, what the data shows and what the reviews are showing, and really try to make sure that we understand that. I'm going to ask a lot of questions to get there, and then proactively deal with that data in a way that's accurate and fair, and that again gets us to the goal of top-level public safety at this facility. At the outset, I do want to say we don't believe that there needs to be a trade-off or a cost consideration necessarily that should ever go into dam safety, into providing that top-level dam safety. This project provides many benefits, which we've talked about, and we'll talk about more as we go through this. Primarily water supply for 26 million people in California. But first and foremost, it has to be a safe project. And that means it needs to be built safely, it needs to be operated safely, and it needs to be maintained safely. So we want, again, I want to say, we want to be the best. And I think what this will hopefully lead to is the best dam safety in not only in the nation, but in the world here at Oroville, for the betterment and the protection of our community that hosts this dam and the downstream communities that are impacted by it. The IRB memo, I really appreciate it. It was very, I thought it was very thorough, and there's a lot of good things there. We're off to a good start. I know we have a long way to go. But some of the things I just wanted to quickly point out that I thought was great was recognizing the need for redundancy. I think that's going to be a big topic as we move forward. Number 2, broadly defining dam safety issues, and expedited action if necessary. If we find something that's a real big issue, that we need to take that expedited action. Number 3, the use of value engineering and planning. I think that's a very great recommendation to really build into this process. Number 4, a holistic approach to evaluate all mechanical, electrical, and control systems at the dam. That was another recommendation I heard out of your memo. I think that was a very good recommendation. Some of the things that I think that you'll hear out of this group that we've heard a long time: erosion risks of an unlined emergency spillway may be unacceptable, and I think that was pointed out in the memo as well. And we saw that in terms of the runoff that went into the river and caused problems, obviously backups into the Hyatt power plant. So that's something that we'll need to discuss. 6, we must account for climate change, and I'm glad that you guys pointed out whatever has to come in there has to account for that. Something that's been said for a long time from this community. And finally, just another, and this doesn't cover everything, but must consider a low-level outlet, and that we have to look at that. And so, I think we're off to a great start with some of the issues that have been identified. I know we're going to get into how we pigeonhole some of those things, but I'm really excited by this opportunity. And I think we've got a great group here that's going to be able to make sure that this comprehensive needs assessment is as comprehensive as it needs to be. And I think that's going to be a key word as we go through this process as well. What is comprehensive, and how do we ensure that we're addressing all of those needed issues? So with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Nielsen for some introductory comments, and thank you all for being here.
James, you were very thorough, and this is I consider fairly historic opportunity. Should have been done through the last 50 years, something like this. But that said, we're looking forward, not back. And I gave Carla a call yesterday, Nemeth, the director, and thanked her for your participation, the department's participation in this, working with all of the community. And that's the key, it's all of the community. And I want to emphasize, this is the state water project, the state water project, and we should shine. And it did, I think, for a lot of years, and then it was kind of, nobody paid much attention until we had a big problem. When we had a problem, we had a really big problem. And one of the products of it is better inspection. And James' bill was signed, the dam inspection. That will improve our opportunities there. Pardon?
Our bill.
Okay, our bill. Yeah, I co-authored it. And so this comprehensive needs assessment, kind of what I look at is it sets the baseline. Where we're at, what we need to do going forward. And that's involvement of a broad group of people, including the Independent Review Board, which is very helpful and very instructive. And then all of the rest of us to get to have our opportunity for input from our various perspectives. The net of that will be better for everybody, and better, most importantly, for the operation and conduct of the state water project. Another part, which is the long term, it's legislation that James and I are carrying to set up something that was patterned on what I did in the 80s with Senate Bill 1086, a management plan for the Sacramento River, which created the Sacramento River Conservation Forum. The success of that is attested to the fact that after 30 years, it's still around. It's still meeting, and the whole purpose of that was to engage the communities up and down the river in matters affecting the river and to improve the river. And it was a success, is a success, because it's still around. And one of my friends, now deceased, Zeke Grader, pioneer fighter for the fish, said that 1086 did more for the salmon run on the Sacramento River than anything else. Now, I think that's kind of overinflated, but if Zeke Grader says something like that, it had to be good. This would then help the community be involved and aware of on an ongoing way of matters affecting the state water project. And that does include the rivers, the levees of the bypasses and the river levees, siltation, desnagging, many other things. But folks, I think this is a pretty historic occasion. I'm honored to be a part of it, working with all of you. John?
Well, thank you. I guess for the department, I first want to start just by thanking both Senator Nielsen and Assemblymember Gallagher for your leadership in pulling this group together. I want to thank all of this group for your time and commitment for this process. For DWR, this is a very important effort for us as we take this long-term look at how do we ensure the safety of the Oroville complex. And such an important part of this process is this effort right here and getting the community input into our study, into our assessment, and then also making sure the community is aware of what's going on and that they're being informed, that they're staying engaged. This is the first time that we have done something like this, and so yeah, we do expect there to be some bumps along the way as we figure out the best way to do this, but at the same time we are very much committed to this process and to making this a successful process. So, thank you.
Maybe if we can go, why don't we start with, we'll go to our next bullet point, and I think maybe John, you can start off on this. We're going to go over kind of the ad hoc group meeting process, and you guys have all received, I believe, copies of the charter that was kind of put together between the parties.
Right.
So maybe go ahead and go over that, John.
So we'll start with. Want to go through it. This is in your, I believe, in your binders here also, if it's easier to see. But one to start, we have this figure up on the screen and it's in your binder under. Let's see if we can find it here for everyone. So it's under your tab for the July 18 meeting. We have this presentation in there. So the third picture in there is this figure up here. And just what we wanted to start with talking about was how this group was going to interact and how these meetings are going to relate to the overall needs assessment and the interaction with the IRB board. Let's see, right there. So the blue bar going across the top, what we're showing is DWR is going to be doing this, all the different assessments and studies that make up the comprehensive needs assessment. Periodically, about quarterly, DWR then is presenting what it's doing with these studies to the IRB board. And so we have a 2-day meetings where we go through what the status is. And then the IRB is then able to provide its comments, its feedback to DWR and the study. And so as that feedback comes in, then DWR is able to take that feedback and adjust its study as appropriate. And so in doing so, the IRB is producing a report at the end of that meeting where they're summarizing their feedback. So then following these meetings, about 3-4 weeks later, we're going to hold these meetings. So all of these meetings are tied to the DWR IRB meetings. And so in these meetings, then DWR is going to come and present a summary of what it presented to the IRB, a status of the studies it's doing. The IRB is then going to be able to present a summary of their report that they produced after the last meeting. And then we're going to have an opportunity for this group then to ask questions, provide comments to DWR and to the IRB. And so then we go over to the next yellow box then. So then we repeat the cycle throughout the whole study period. At the next IRB meeting, when the IRB produces its summary report, it's in that report, they're going to be providing their responses to the questions that have come out of the ad hoc group. And similarly, DWR will also be providing its responses to the questions that it gets. And so this process the cycle will repeat itself. We're scheduled to have this completed by the end of 2019. And so we have these meetings about quarterly as we go through that. I don't know if there's any questions at this point, or we'll.
I want to add something here that is important. As we proceed, and we will be proceeding towards certain actions, a good part of that is going to be related to budgetary considerations. And with James's leadership in the Assembly and mine in the Senate, and my role as Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee, we are going to have a lot of firsthand knowledge to work with the administration in the presentation of the administration's budget, and most of that work has to be done in November and December. Because what I'd like to do when we have monetary needs, that we get them submitted in the governor's submitted budget the 1st of January, rather than have to work it in the process. Now, we can do that too as the budget process unfolds, but the point I wanted to make, it's going to be really important that we use that information to translate into action, and part of that action is going to have to be budgetary for sure.
Thank you. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk through was the charter, and the charter was a document that we have jointly worked on. We had a small group with Matt and Ron and Rob to work on with DWR to come up with a structure with some guidelines for our interactions here. And we thought it was important to get this down in writing, because I think it's important. This is a way to have a good common baseline understanding of the purpose of the CNA and how we're going to interact together. Had 4 sections in the charter that I just want to go through here fairly quickly. In the purpose, the first part lay out that the charter sets the roles and responsibilities and how we're going to interact for these meetings. In the second section, in the background, we described the CNA study itself as being this dam safety effort to enhance the integrity and the resiliency of the Oroville Dam, and ensuring that the facilities are going to function as they're intended. We also know this is going to be a forward-looking effort, so we're looking forward long-term at what changes need to be made at the facility. It's not an investigation of what happened at the spillway incident, looking back at things that have happened previously. And then also in the section, we described the IRB. In the third section, in the roles and responsibilities section, talk about the role of the ad hoc group, which I think Assemblymember Gallagher characterized quite. I like how you characterized it, but it's really being this conduit between the study and the community, and so it's taking the information that you're getting here back to your constituents, back to the community, and then getting that input from the broader community and bringing that to the study efforts, so that input's included. And then in the section, we also talk about the support DWR is providing for these meetings. So we're going to have we have Kearns and West here with Eric providing facilitation or providing coordination for our meetings, and then also providing the venue here. The last section in the rules of engagement, we're capturing this how these meetings will be run. So we start off, we talk about the table that we just looked at. One of the key things that we talked about with the small group and came to agreement on was really the need to keep a consistent group through the whole process, because we picture each of these meetings building on the other one. So we think it's real important that your commitments to participate through the whole process will make this far more effective. And then the last bit is just some of the mechanics, which I think would be helpful to talk through how the meetings are conducted. So the co-chairs are going to come up with an agenda ahead of each meeting, so we'll work jointly to develop that. About a week ahead of time, we're going to have all of the materials submitted out to the ad hoc group, so you can have time to review what we're going to be talking about. The co-chairs we're going to jointly run the meetings here, but then we have Kearns and West here to help us take notes and to help us coordinate, but the meetings are being run by the co-chairs. At the end of the meeting, we're going to get a summary produced by Kearns and West. Then the co-chairs will review that summary and make sure we approve it, we agree with the summary, and then we'll distribute that out to this group. And then 2 weeks after this meeting, by 2 weeks, we'd like to get all of the different questions from the ad hoc group that you don't bring up right here in the meeting, but you think of later. We'd like to get those to Kearns and West, so that then they'll come to the co-chair, so we can come up with an agreed upon set to send to the IRB. And so this was a jointly developed process here, and so we're looking at how we can formalize this, but this is basically our plan, is to proceed with this process here, unless anyone has any concerns with what we've gone through.
Is there any questions at all or comments on the kind of charter? It's just kind of outlining our process and procedures for.
I have a concern.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Kearns and West is going to, as a facilitator, we worked with them during the licensing, and I'm not going to go there, but I don't want them to make the conclusions for press releases without whoever is representing my view making sure it's objective. because they tend to always put out a press release. Look how good DWR is doing for the community. Look how great this is going. And it's not necessarily in my historical background with their relationship with them, what really the community's thinking. I think Larry could back me up on that at Orac and other places.
No, man, I definitely hear that concern. Just one thing I would point out is, number one, we as the co-chairs are going to be running the meeting. So, you know, I mean, Kearns and West is here as a facilitator, but really I look at it as we're facilitating the meeting. They're going to provide meeting summaries.
Well, I'm going to trust you to make sure that it's neutral based.
That's why we set it up the way we did. They're going to provide meeting summaries, which will come to us before they go public. And
well, now I know for sure that you're the guy. Thank you.
But, and also just to point out, they will not be issuing any press releases whatsoever. Any press releases that are done are going to be done jointly between the group and DWR, right?
Thank you.
Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we
we did a press release today announcing that this group was coming together, right? But that was coordinated between our Senator Nielsen and my offices and DWR. Kearns and West didn't have anything to do with that.
Yeah,
the operative word is they are facilitators.
I think the only thing to add to that, because they're correct, is that when there are times that we don't agree, because there will be, is that if you guys want to do a press release on your own, that we kind of communicate ahead of time, more of a heads up, so that we understand each other's opinions, but not that you can't, and it's more just giving each other a heads up.
Any other questions or comments on the charter?
No, there was a couple of things that we didn't hammer out, kind of got verbal agreements, but not written in. Although there may not be need,
Although there may not be need, I think just like you have additional support surrounding this table, should something come up in which we think it's necessary to bring in guest speakers, subject matter experts, that they would be allowed to come in just for that purpose. I can't think of anything, maybe climate change, maybe PMF forecasting or something, to get just another fresh set of eyes, that when those items hit the agenda, that we may be allowed to bring in such guest speakers for that purpose.
Human factors, well, that's not going to, is human factors going to be part of it?
It's more of an
Infrastructure, but catastrophic risk management, you know, is obviously something that might, but maybe you could respond to that, Joel, like, you think there's opportunities to do that later in the process here, where we might bring in some people, the ad hoc might bring in some people as.
Yeah, I think ultimately the co-chairs are going to decide on the agenda, but I think from our perspective, you know, if it's going to help the conversation for the IRB, who's really the conduit of bringing back information, yes. As long as we don't, you know, overload the IRB and the meetings with so many presentations that we're really not going to get focused on what we need, I don't see a problem with, you know, they'll be approving, you guys would be approving those type of things.
And to streamline the process, a lot of it could probably be brought in as a written statement and not actually guest speakers, but I'd like to have that option open. The organizational information, I take this job as representing the community very serious, and I know this is going to be posted on the Oroville website, but the information that's on that website should be such that the average citizen can look at that, disseminate the information with all the supporting documents from not only the review board, but the board of consultants, and ask quality questions and avoid redundancy. Otherwise, our job representing the deeper community beyond our coalition is going to become very time-consuming. So that organization of information on the website may be an evolving process as we go to help us with that end of it. And last, and I think it was pointed out in the first review board report, is we'd like the opportunity to put in coalition goals, secondary benefits, feared consequences, you know, as they mentioned in value engineering and stuff, early into the process before these alternative projects get too far down the tracks. I think by doing that, a better chance of coming up with win-win solutions between community and the department before ideas get too entrenched in their minds. So those are the only three things I'd like to make sure we clarify.
So, and I don't hear any opposition to any of those points. I think that will all be things that are going to be built into the process. And we've talked previously, Matt, about, we want to find a way to ensure that we're getting the broader community to be able to, work through us, to communicate through us, so that we can then transmit their questions and concerns into these meetings. And that's also the reason why we have this up to 10 days after our meetings to submit written questions and concerns, so that can get back to the IRB as well. Because not everything is going to get accomplished in just this meeting that we're here. We're going to need to, and we might think of things afterwards, and we might talk to people afterwards. We go, hey, well, we didn't think about this. That's why we built that into this process too. Yeah.
One other thing I want to add to this, and I think it is important, that as we do all we will be doing in a sustained way, we keep it in the context of the 2009 new state water plan. That was an exhaustively negotiated revision of the whole water plan for the state of California. And it's a guiding element to all things related to the operation of the State Water Project and delivering water throughout California to assure the needs of California. So I'll try to get that a document to that effect together out of the water code, and we can distribute it to everybody just to take a look at. Because in context, it was very significant. Nothing just earth-shaking changes in state water policy, but I think there was some new focuses. For example, for decades, water policy in California was all Delta-centric. It was all about the Delta. And I'm a former Delta senator. I care about the Delta. But all water policy is not about the Delta. And further, it's come to be realized there's a north, a central, a south, but also, which always had been neglected, there's an east and a west to water in California. And that policy was reflected in that new water plan.
Yeah, I want to clarify, just set a little more on the expectations, because Matt and I and Ron Stork did have conversations, and Rob around this, and then Assemblyman Gallagher and myself on secondary benefits. The department is fully supportive of, obviously, always, we want to get the maximum out of our facilities. So if there's secondary benefits, we always want to do that. I just want to keep clear that our first priority is public safety and making sure the dam infrastructure is the safest it can be to manage all risks. So that's going to be the primary focus here. And between now and December, the IRB is set up really to address that. And so they really are not going to be involved in the secondary benefits. They may weigh in on that, but their expertise is really on the infrastructure and making sure. So I just want to set expectations that we may not resolve all those secondary benefits, because this first phase until December is really, what do we need? What's the performance of the dam that we need? And that's what the IRB is going to help us determine. Once we get past that and we get to, this is what we need, now how do we build it? That's, I think, when the benefits, the secondary benefits really come in. But we do want to capture them now, because the thoughts that we have today, so that we don't forget about them or we keep them. But I just want to set expectations that we may not go very deep in those secondary benefits during this phase. But we don't want to lose those thoughts. So I'm just throwing that out there so kind of we all are on the same page. Right, Matt?
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add to that is just, it may come up that change, because the focus is infrastructure, right? The focus is very much infrastructure and the facilities up here, and making sure that they're, like you said, top level of public safety. There may be changes identified or modifications identified that could have an impact on secondary benefits that people currently receive or understand. And that's where we might want to better understand how those could impact those things, right? And I think that would be good for this discussion, for this group, right? Okay, any other questions or comments on the chart? Matt, did you have the matrix? I think we're going to get into the matrix as we get down here, because that's, and matrix, what I mean by that is we're talking about trying to develop a sheet with, like, hey, what are the swim lanes for the tasks that are identified as part of this comprehensive needs assessment, what's included, what's maybe not included. And so you want to...
Yeah, let me touch on that. So
if I could just finish up on the charter, if there's any other questions on the charter, and if there isn't, what I'd say is maybe we can, let's entertain a motion just to adopt the charter as our sort of operating procedures for the group. Yes, Ron.
I'm okay with the charter with perhaps one exception, and that's the nature of what the IRB will review and assess. I think the IRB has already offered some suggestions to refine that, its role, and what the department's looking at. So the charter, at least as regards to our group's efforts, I think is workable, but recognize that that some of these areas are going to evolve as we jointly move together, and so what's written today may become obsolete, or at least
you mean for those tasks, for the 6 tasks?
Exactly, right.
I think that's going to get, I think nobody would disagree with this, those are going to get refined by the IRB and by input and feedback from this group, right, as we move forward.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, or would you say,
I'm not going to say they're going to get refined, but if there's comments here that the IRB sees are things that should be taken back to the engineering group, they will be, and then they'll be assessed and determined feasible, not feasible from a monetary, but just from the goals and what we're trying to accomplish and the schedule and all that. So, and I know, Ron and I had a lot of discussions on schedule. I'll be the guy that is pushing the schedule because I want to get to an end game so we can start making improvements. So the schedule will be important. So with that said, if there's feedback back to the IRB, they believe it's information that needs to be passed on, that's their call, and that'll happen.
I mean, like one example I just put out is like the technical memo actually even recommends a 7th task, in terms of integration, right, of these things. So some of those things are going to be kind of naturally refined. It's not like this is exactly set in stone, like, hey, this is the sub headings of each task are all we're going to talk about, right?
Yeah, I think they'll be no different than the Board of Consultants, I think, on the recovery, where we take the recommendations very seriously, and I don't think there's been any recommendation on the Board of Consultants for the recovery that we've not taken. So if they recommend it, I can almost say most likely it would be something the department would adopt.
Larry?
One thing, since I heard so much emphasis on infrastructure and stuff like that, and having been involved in major industries, utilities and things like that, when they have some type of incident and everything, I don't understand how you divorce infrastructure from the O&M culture, all et cetera, aspects of operations and maintenance from the infrastructure. And I was just wondering, is there a place where those two elements get integrated? Because I guess that's what concerns me. I didn't see that. There's the emphasis on infrastructure, but I guess one example I recall from was the nuclear power industry. When after for those would still have memories of that, the 3 Mile Island thing, it completely revised the industry's approach to how they, and changed the culture and everything else like this. We've had a major incident here, and so many of the incidences that have occurred have been traced back to some management human things, whether you go to the river valve, the turbines, the fire at the powerhouse, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't see that element, and I don't understand how you can divorce infrastructure solely and look at it, because I don't believe you can build any infrastructure that somebody can't screw up. And so that's my concern, that I did not see the integration of the human, cultural, corporate, et cetera, type of infrastructure over the physical infrastructure, and I didn't see that integration in this, and that is something I didn't understand.
You may want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think I see it in here too, but let's talk about it.
Yeah, a lot of those other issues are definitely areas that you agree the maintenance and how you and all the organizational issues are very important, and that is where DWR has a lot of other activities it's doing, where it's all the revisions to the dam safety program and all the efforts there. So definitely important. Those are occurring over in that other area. For here, this study though is focused on what is the infrastructure that is needed. It does have that infrastructure focus. Once that infrastructure is there, of course, it'll have to be meshed in with all of the improved dam safety efforts that the department's doing, because yes, those are very important, do have to come together. But it's just not the focus of where we are at this stage, because this is still a very early stage of looking at the infrastructure needs.
And I want to point out two things that are in the technical memo that I think speak to this too. Is
the focus is on infrastructure, because that's really what a comprehensive needs assessment is doing. We're saying, hey, what's the facility right now? Where is there deficiencies? Where is there maybe a need for upgrades, right? Or for modifications and improvements to the overall infrastructure. But as it says in the technical memo, the IRB recommends that the CNA project team consider a holistic approach to the evaluation of all mechanical, electrical, and control systems required for the safe operation of Oroville Dam, including those associated with, for example, with the operation of Hyatt Power Plant. And that's in the, so already we know that like an evaluation of the infrastructure is necessarily going to have to include how does this impact what operations are going to be, right? And another example is when they talk here about the need for this information will be especially important for modifications that involve human intervention or operation. So if you have a new piece of infrastructure, or we're doing things that are going to necessarily involve human operation and intervention, working gates, how much flow you're putting down, etc. Those are going to necessarily come in, and I don't know, maybe some of the IRB members might be able to speak to that, but necessarily there's going to be some discussion as part of the infrastructure focus on how operations are going to be affected, especially those that require humans to operate them. Does that make sense, Larry?
Larry, that was an issue, of course, that came to pass. How much water are you going to let out? What are you going to maintain the lake levels at? I think that's clearly something that's going to, if you guys want the operation of the facility itself, it's an integral part of it. As I read it, I thought we pretty well had it covered. Yeah, Ron?
I just want to give an opportunity for the IRB maybe to just comment on some of that.
So I think what we'll do is we'll wait for our presentation, because I think we're going to try to address some of that in, not in great detail, but I do believe from a human element, that was part of what we were looking at. We recognize that human behavior has a huge impact on operations of any significantly complex system such as Oroville Dam.
Ron, did you have something else?
I did have a question.
I do want to try and get us into the next topic here pretty soon.
And this is for Joel, and once again it goes to scope, which is kind of embedded in our charter, and I suggested that perhaps that was the only caveat that I had, that the scope might actually might change with time and differ slightly or be refined from the charter. But at least as I understand what the department believes it will be focusing on in the CNA is infrastructure issues, and of course as they relate to operations, they are indeed, that human element is going to be an important part. But it also, at least as in the discussions that I've had with the department, they are also expecting to take a look at the reservoir regulation manual and how that
might change or make recommendations for changes. So, and the operations manual is not an infrastructure manual. It obviously relies on infrastructure and the reliability and resilience and all that a part of the infrastructure, but that's distinctly operations. So do we understand that scope of the CNA correctly? Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Well, so just with that, I would entertain a motion that we just adopt the charter as our, with the caveat that Ron pointed out that, these tasks may be getting refined as we're kind of moving through the process. If I can maybe have a motion to that effect.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Nami, is there a second?
Can I add one more, because this is a partnership, and I think we're establishing a partnership, but the department works with FERC, DSOD, all the the regulatory bodies. So everything we want to change, because this is a FERC and DSOD approved activity, we work through them also. So it's not a DWR just says yes and it's a done deal. It goes through the process through them. It needs to get approved before we make changes. So just want to make that clear so that as we work through this process, we know it's a partnership. That's what made the recovery so successful, is because we did develop a good partnership with FERC and DSOD. They really support this, so I know they'll be working with us, but that's another partnership that we got to keep in mind.
And that's the beauty of what we've got convened here. We're all going to be involved regularly discussing these issues. There's not many going to be slipping through the cracks that we don't know about.
Right. So, all right, so did I have a second over here?
I'll second the understanding that as the scope develops, we can bring it back for the body to revise it.
And, all right, moved and second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. All right, so let's, if we can move in, move into the topics and
wrap up,
venues.
yeah, we can. This will wrap up our process portion of this meeting here. So what we want to do is just talk about, so we do have a lot of things that we expect to come up in these meetings. And so some of those clearly within the scope of the CNA. And so that's that first column where obviously we'll discuss those. They'll be part of these discussions here. We wanted to talk about what's the plan for things that come up here that aren't in the scope of the CNA. And so we do want to have those captured. So we came up with this process. Topics outside of the scope of the CNA, outside of this dam safety focus. Some of those will have an existing forum where they could be discussed. Some of them won't. And so what our plan is here for these is, as these questions come up, DWR will record these. So we have Liza over here who is going to be charged with capturing these kinds of questions that are out of the scope of the CNA. And so then we can either, if there's an existing forum, we can identify that and we can address those topics there. If there's not, then DWR will look at, can we find a suitable forum? Can we create a suitable forum? And the idea is that all of the information that we're getting here about the studies as part of the CNA, that information we can all use in these other forums where these other topics are more appropriately discussed. So any questions, Ron?
So this is potentially the beginning of the matrix that we were just discussing. Apparently they want a microphone here.
Also the microphone.
Very good.
So the small group has had a number of discussions with the department about the importance of understanding that there's a whole bunch of proceedings and contemplated proceedings and processes that are either expected to deal with some issues or not assigned to any issues yet. And for both the department, for this ad hoc group, and for the IRB, it's really important for us as we surface issues and examine venues to try and get at least, well, the department's perspective on where these issues are going to get addressed or not addressed, and the perspective of various bodies, including ours, on where they should be addressed. And so because I think a number of us have thought about the comprehensive needs assessment in various ways. Some perhaps envisioned it to be more comprehensive than I think the department currently envisions it to be. But in it, those discussions are important to have about what indeed the scope of this process is. But we can't represent the community very well unless we have a pretty thorough understanding about issues and venues in which they're going to get resolved. And so we've had discussions with the department about, well, let's develop a matrix in which we can represent that so that we and the community and the department and the IRB kind of know where the playing field is. And in the absence of that, we're not doing our job very well, and we'll just be confused. Our meetings will be unproductive. So we've urged the department to try and work with us to develop that matrix as expeditiously as possible. That said, I suspect it will be, assuming the department actually continues to agree that we need to resolve some of these issues and to document where we're going to handle them, that is likely to be a growing and evolving document with time.
Yeah, and I think from our department standpoint, we agree with that. I think that is a document we still see there being utility in and do want to continue to work on developing. I think it'll be informed as we get specific questions and we can start mapping those out. I think that'll help us grow that document over time. So I think that's a good approach to take for it.
Kind of summarize by saying that is the intent from the department to work on this matrix and developing that.
Fill it as best we can. I mean, there might be some areas we don't know how to navigate through in this group, and we're going to do our best. You know, I think there's a lot of history here, and for us to just come out and say everything that you guys bring up, we're going to have a home for. I can't just say that up front,
right, but I think we're not expecting that, just that we'll work on this matrix and understand where these issues get resolved. I think is kind of what Ron was going to do. But I think a lot of issues will probably be will be in this one. You know?
Yeah, no, that's.
Anyways.
That takes us through that takes us through the process part of our agenda. So I think next we wanted to get some of the community perspective is our next item there.
Great. So yeah, I mean, we wanted to have a section here where we kind of get out some of the community perspective of the facility itself and how and issues that from the community perspective of deficiencies, issues. And so I wanted to start with Supervisor Conley, if you would, and then kind of anybody who wants to kind of offer a perspective from the community on concerns, issues, perceived deficiencies of the existing infrastructure.
I qualify to say, what have we learned and what do we need to yet learn going forward?
So it's difficult just to talk, I'm not an engineer or anything like that, just to talk about the facility itself because it's so impactful on the local community. The failure of the spillway and the evacuation put a great deal of fear into people. The use of the emergency spillway, which was widely known within the community and shouldn't be done, put a lot of fear into the community. So out of this, what I want to bring back to people is a more thorough understanding of the facility and the repairs and what we expect in the future with those repairs and how that'll affect operations. Also, the community is aware that we've had warm rain on snow, and it's coming ever increasing cycles. It's not every 10 years, it was 2 years in a row. We just had capacity. Also, the community has a fear, or actually a wholesome fear, of the Army Corps' operations for flood control. If you have 185% of snow, folks, you can't hold the lake at 850, because now we know you can't get it out through the bottom, and you can't get it over the spillway if there's an incident like happened recently. So we'd like to see a more scientific, and I know it's not the engineering side of it, but we need a more scientific study of the hydrology of the entire basin and understand how to hold the lake at a safe level at all times. Because our concern here, I'm sure the sheriff's concern is, public safety has got to be number one when we go back to the public. Beyond that, you know, we want to isolate this into engineering, but it all impacts recreation too. If you come out of this and you find that you got to operate this facility at a lower level, that's a monetary impact to the community. So I'll just briefly state that we always look at water deliveries last. We don't really care about how much power you deliver because we don't get any of it. And we always put our recreation above that, and totally above that is our safety. And it gets down to, you know, your personal family safety and the safety of your businesses and your community. So that's a perspective I'm going to bring, but I'm here to learn. And I'd really like you to address a few things. I mean, I want to know what's going on with the gates. Do they need to be rebuilt eventually? I want to know why they're cracking. That's well known in the community. Why one of the parts of the powerhouse doesn't operate. Is that cracked? Is it true? The wet spot on the dam has never been, I know I've heard a lot of explanations, best of which is clays over it and stuff. These things need to be fully addressed and brought out to the community so they feel safe. Because again, I'll conclude with I think our downstream people too, our number one thing would be public safety. So that's my brief perspective, and if you'll excuse me, I have to go get a real driver's license, and I can't get another date. I'm going to be there at 9:30. Thank you.
I will, Mr. Conley. Thank you. And I would echo Mr. Conley's comments, and just start off by saying that I personally never, ever want to be in the situation that we were in on February 12th of 2017. Having been in this room, Lieutenant Bell and I were commenting the last time we were in here together was that day when that decision was made, and certainly it has impacted this entire community as well as downstream communities. And so to the point that our primary focus should be public safety, which incorporates into it, in my view, dam safety, both in terms of infrastructure as well as operation, to keep us from getting to the point where we're at February of 2017. I think that's an important focus. I also think that through my experience, I have gained a deeper understanding of the California State Water Project and Oroville Dam's key role in the State Water Project. Certainly, I'm by no means an expert in that and have a lot to learn. But when I look at public safety, I certainly first am concerned about my community, the people of Butte County, because they've elected me to protect them. But in a broader context, I feel like I have a duty to all of the downstream constituents, which include, as Assemblyman Gallagher said, the nearly 26 or 7 million people in the state of California who rely upon the State Water Project. And when I look at that public safety issue, I have come to the understanding that if this facility is compromised in terms of infrastructure or operation, not only does it affect this community, but you will have a public safety crisis, the likes of which I don't think we ever want to see throughout the state of California if we can't effectively deliver water to those 26 million people in Southern California. And so you'll hear, from my perspective, a lot of comment or concern, should there be some, about the overall risk and threat to public safety, not just to the community, not just to our region, but also to the state of California and its impact on the State Water Project.
Anybody else, please feel free to chime in here. I don't know, Matt, Matt is a multiple evacuee. I think would have some good perspective.
Yeah. What is it like to live behind, the State Water Project dam? To put your 84-year-old mother into a car in moments' notice and be stuck in traffic for 4 hours? To watch your father step off of one of Governor Duke Majan's helicopters with tears in his eyes burns an image in your conscious mind that lasts a lifetime. To see the business that he spent so long inundated. To stand on the levee in '97 with water lapping just inches from the top because we were letting out rumored to be 165,000 instead of 150. Because of a surcharge part of the manual that was to give us a 20% that Marysville Dam wasn't going to give us, and we never wanted to use that surcharge that we opted to over-release. To be stacking TVs and computer equipment at the Target store in preparation to evacuate and getting permission from the district manager to open up a tab for first responders should they need any equipment. And all they were asking for is mud boots and shovels. That's how we defend ourselves around here. Probably what hurt worst of all came, 6 months ago, when the independent forensic team sent out their report, and reading through Chapter 6 on the human and organizational opportunities that were missed in the process. I've spent a long time in large operations, Target and Home Depot, as process analysis and auditing stores, and I can tell you that it was not usually the employees. It was not DWR staff. We don't blame you. I think with all your talents, you still have to answer to a higher power. And higher powers can sometimes get strayed if there's not public oversight. And we really welcome this process. We want this to be a shining example of the good and the integrity, the honesty, the pride that can come out when you turn the light on and shine public spotlight into this process. And really thank the Independent Review Board for the great work they've already done on that first report that is going to help guide us and be that mediator between the public and the department. Thank all of my peers for answering the call when your name was called, and look forward to making this a historical event very successful.
Matt passes microphone to Joel.
Any others? I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but if you wanted to say, this is just an opportunity to kind of give them a little bit of a view of what, and I think they've heard this in different contexts, but of what those community perspectives are about the dam. Sandy, go ahead. Yeah.
I will wait for the microphone. Sandy Linville, as the former director for the Chamber of Commerce when February 12th of 2017 happened, one of the biggest responses that we saw from the community even prior to the evacuation order, were getting the number of phone calls of what do we do? How do we do this? Are we going to have to evacuate? And then hearing, from the DWR that no, everything is going to be fine, you're okay. And then getting that call or that notification on that Sunday afternoon. I think one of the things that really needs to be recognized is the deep rift of mistrust between the community and the DWR. It's really difficult for the community to have and place faith in the DWR that everything is going to be okay, because that's what we heard before. And not only that's what we heard before, but then that faithful Sunday afternoon notification came that said, by the way, imminent dam failure, get out now. I think this ad hoc group is a step in the right direction in repairing the relationship between the DWR and the community. It's not going to be easy, and I think the DWR recognize that you have a long road ahead of you to be able to repair that trust. Looking at the infrastructure is important, but also looking at that organizational human factor of it too, because it is the people that run it, it is the people that matter, and it's the people that live and host the dam and the downstream communities that matter too. It's just a long history of mistrust that needs to be built and really take care to rebuild that trust.
Sandy passes microphone to Ron.
This is Ron Stork again. These are heartfelt comments, and I think that it's really important, I think, for the department, for this ad hoc group, for the IRB, and for the community to walk a journey together, to understand the circumstances that we're in and that we face and what we're going to do about it. And if we walk that journey together, that kind of that joint fact-finding and understanding truthfully and honestly where we are and where we want to be and where we need to be, that's the way to do it. And that's the way to repair the mistrust between the community and the department. And it's something that I think the department should recognize that it needs to do. I think the fact that it's allowed an ad hoc group to be formed and to at least invite us into walking this journey together speaks for, I think, the department's willingness to repair those problems. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be successful. I don't want to embark in a process that I think will fail. So I'm willing to give it a try. I'm pleased that we have an ad hoc group that is willing to give it a try. The department is willing to give it a try, and the IRB is willing to give it a try. And let's do it well, and let's do it together.
Ron and Sandy, that's what this is all about. And we've bought into it, James and I and Congressman LaMalfa. The community clearly has, and DWR has. And I will attest, I'm the #1 critic of government in Sacramento. One paper said one time, a big headline, Nielsen style bash the bureaucrat. Well, you know, I pat him on the back too. And this is kind of a rare thing for an agency to so enthusiastically embrace that community involvement. And it's a recognition, I believe, by the department that that is a critical need and that they're going to address it. And I thank them because I think they're righteous about it. And our job is to keep us all on task. And that means the community, too. We can't tune out and be too busy to show up. All of us have to be a part of this. And if that has happened, then I see a very good pathway ahead, and I see something very historically created, because there are, in all kinds of different areas, such problems all over California, meaning major agencies of government that have regulatory and responsibility over our lives being insulated and not open to public input. This is a very significant commitment that the department's making, and I think they're going to make the best of it, and I know that all of us around the table here are going to do the same thing.
A microphone is handed to Laura.
Congressman LaMalfa, you know, we hear a lot from our constituents about a lot of the things that have already been discussed here. Certainly safety is #1. But it's really hard to look at this in a vacuum, or, you know, I know we want to isolate the dam complex, so to speak, but I do want to encourage that you look at the downstream infrastructure also, because as you're looking at how this can operate, the infrastructure downstream is really important, and how water is released, at what quantities. It really, it can destroy the levees. It can cause a lot of sediment in the river, and this is a constant problem that we've been dealing with. So the downstream infrastructure really needs to be part of the dam infrastructure. In my opinion, looking at it, because we get so many comments from downstream farmers that their property has been eroded by the river, that, levee walls have collapsed because of the, high levels, and then all of a sudden, if it's cut off fast, what happens? So these are a lot of important issues that need to be addressed as we're looking at this. Also, we do look at, there's a lot of competing interests. We do have safety as number one. We do have recreation, but I will add on to what Bill say, but our downstream needs, water deliveries, are very, very important. We cannot overlook the fact that this area of California, our farmers are not only supporting the state of California, our nation, but the world, what comes out of here. And again, I will also tag on to Sheriff Honey that public safety also is in our food supply. So we have water deliveries to 26 million people, but we supply the food to a lot of the world, and that's a higher number than 26 million. And if we don't have water, we can't grow food.
Laura passes microphone to Curtis.
So I think, you heard some really good perspectives there. I mean, there's a lot of, I would echo almost all those comments, as I would echo them. To Laura's point right here, another thing I saw, and you could tell I read this report very closely, but one of the things I'll point out, again, IRB recommends that the CNA project team question previous assumptions regarding downstream consequence thresholds and take advantage of the new incremental dam breach hydraulic analysis to develop accurate consequence information. I think that speaks very well to, hey, we need to think about what happens when we do these releases, what's going to happen downstream. And so that, again, I think that's a very important point here that gets here. But real quickly, and because I know we have a lot to cover, one of my earliest memories is going with my dad to help evacuate one of our friends out of the Nicholas area when the water was getting high and we knew that it was flood stage. And patrolling levees with him and hoping it's not going to break. And that same man that we helped evacuate is one of the most knowledgeable, practical flood control guys I've ever known. I still call him to this day and I ask him questions. But one of the things that he always would say in 86 and 97 when we had these events, he goes, they're holding too much damn water up there. They're holding too much damn water and we're going to be in a bad situation because we got Pineapple Express. If Pineapple Express comes, we got a bunch of water, and we need to be cognizant of that. So that's something that's always stuck with me, and I think certainly during flood season, when we know we've got a big snowpack, the community has always felt like, man, we need to have a better way to operate to ensure safety downstream. So, when people, even during the 2017 incident, I had to talk to the interim director at the time, because he had said, well, we put 160 down in 97 and it handled it. Well, no, it didn't handle it because we had breaks. And I had to go to him and say, hey, I know you may just not have been familiar with this, because I think in our heads, we think, especially as engineers, we think like, hey, this should work, right? But people know downstream, and this group knows from living here, the perspective that, hey, man, you get over 150,000 CFS on a release, there's going to be problems downstream on those levees, And let me tell you, a break of a levee next to Yuba City with 70,000 people in it, we're talking big time loss of life and property, So that's, that's always been a perspective of the downstream community, is like, hey, why are they operating this way? And I say perspective, I want to put perspective on here, because a perspective needs to be refined by knowledge and more information. And that's what I'm hoping in this room we can kind of figure out, hey, what really are the issues there? As I've come to learn from others, even from Mike and talking to him, is like, well, in that kind of situation, a 97 type situation, that's a lot of water to deal with, and even lowering it might not completely deal with that situation. These type of flood events are nothing new. They've gone all the way back to the beginning of the history of California. We've always had these huge flood event years where a lot of water is coming down that system. In '97, 320,000 CFS inflow, peak inflow coming into Oroville Dam. I mean, this system can do some serious outflow, you know, that come down this system. So, you know, one of the things we want to understand is, like, how can we make sure this is operated better, you know, to ensure that that's not an issue. Another just quick perspective from the community is there has long been a perspective and a feeling that this is operated mostly for the benefit of the water supply contractors. That goes to that comment from the gentleman I talked to you about. They're holding too much water up there, you know, holding too much water right now, and why are they doing that for? For the people down south, you know? It also goes to a perspective that things weren't done from a maintenance or an infrastructure standpoint because it was too costly, or that there was cost pressures on doing needed infrastructure improvements. And again, I want to say that is a perspective that has long been held by the community. Now, the independent forensics team did find that there was, you know, they said cost pressures were present, you know, from the water contractors. So, you know, people have, and I think from this process, what the community wants to know is that whatever we decide is needed to make that top level public safety, that there's not going to be cost considerations on that. That there's not going to be, oh, well, hey, you know, we don't think we need to spend that money. You know, if we decide that it's something that is needed to provide that top level public safety. So I mean, I think I would provide both of those perspectives as something that the community really has always been frustrated and concerned about. And that's where, look, I think coming to this, we want to get the information. We want to know what does the data show, what is, you know, but all with a view towards really trying to get at some of these fundamental problems that have always been with the community. So, okay, go ahead.
Just a little bit of proof in the pudding, though. In this last budget, just passed a few weeks ago, almost $1/3 of $1 billion in that budget for some of these needs. Now, last year, when I made the try to interject some money that was $200 million then in the Budget Conference Committee, all of a sudden, all the votes disappeared. And there was some pressure that came down from somewhere, and I'm not even going to get into where, but they said, no, we're not going to do that. Well, this year, the support for our efforts exceeded my expectations. Now, every year is a new year. The appropriation is not a continuous one. But there was an absolute significant commitment to repairing our infrastructure along the river, including our levees, including sediment, and that is very significant. So we take that to the bank. And now we have a more formal group of esteemed and respected people that will be inputting the process that will help us even more.
A microphone is passed to Mike.
I'll be real brief, because I think some of the sentiments here were expressed very eloquently, and I applaud DWR for making this effort. I guess that's the carrot. The stick is, please don't make this a check-the-box kind of exercise. I'm hopeful and optimistic that this will result in some meaningful issues that are resolved. And I don't want to put too fine a point on the sort of the downstream impacts, but I guess my comments are directed at the independent review panel, and it is that, you know, through the event, and I think this is both historic, traditional, it's legal, for a lot of complicated reasons, Division of Safety of Dams, FERC, dam owners, state water project facilities
right out of the gate, whenever an incident happens with the dam, they're quick to sort of draw a line at the end of the spillway, at the end of the FERC boundaries, and say, hey, it's not my bag downstream. You locals got to deal with that, raise money and fix those things downstream. And I would hope that the term comprehensive needs assessment really looks at the impacts of dam operation, of levee infrastructure in a truly comprehensive way. And I'm appealing to the engineers in the independent review panel to look at it that way. One of the dirty little secrets that we were not very public about in terms of what Sabufka was doing downstream, what others were doing on both sides of the river, one of the dirty little secrets is that the real engineers sort of on the wrong side of these levees downstream of Oroville Dam, we weren't as concerned as the public was about what was happening at the spillway. There was a levee in downtown Yuba City that was failing, and while it doesn't have the consequences of damage, of dam failure or anything like that, I think the real engineers recognize that a failure of the Yuba City levee with very little water on it, there were sinkholes, there were boils, everybody had already come back to the city, they weren't leaving town anytime soon, they're just not leaving. Once, you can only cry wolf once, as Mr. Honey knows, and people aren't going to be leaving.
You weren't crying wolf, my friend.
I know that.
It was a serious matter.
Apologies to Mr. Honey. Everybody knows you did the right thing. But we are not going to get out, people aren't going to be leaving. And so one of the sort of the not well understood issues is that the levees, because they're built to such a very low standard compared to dams. And frankly, that's an issue we can't resolve here. That will always be the case, that they were on the verge of failure in a highly populated city, as Mr. Gallagher explained. That was going to kill people. And that will always be sort of that issue. The standard of care for levees compared to dams there will always be this huge delta, and that's why we do things like floodplain management. That's why there are flood fights. That's why Mr. Gallagher and Nielsen led the way to fix things after the fact, patch it together, flood fight. You just don't see that kind of mitigation for large high hazard structures like dams. So I'm appealing to the IRB to sort of look at things downstream truly in a comprehensive way. And maybe that results in looking at a risk assessment that is, without changing the scope, but looking at taking the risk assessment geographically a little bit further downstream than perhaps what this all started out with. That's all I had to say. Thank you. Again, apologies to. I'll be paying for that for a long time. Right.
You will not. You're fine.
Mike, after the next session, you can come back and say, "Oops, no, I used the wrong word. Let me clarify what way."
All right. Well, shall we?
Yeah. With that, why don't we? Yeah. I think that was very good. It gives, I think, you guys a good view of some of the different concerns and perspectives, from the community. So maybe now we can move to the next segment here, from DWR, presenting the comprehensive needs assessment process and overview. Yeah.
Ted Craddock moves to front of room to give presentation.
I'm going to keep powering through unless you guys really want to. Let's just keep going here. Yeah, we're good.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Ted Craddock, and it's kind of tough to follow that discussion we just had. That was, some emotional parts of it, and for me personally, emotional as well. I have family that lives in Yuba City. My dad was a longtime resident, and he went through the evacuations in our family in '97 and '17, and we have employees with DWR that are part of the community, so we take this personally as well, and so. But I'll move into the presentation. So what we wanted to do is just provide a little bit of, few-minute background on the Oroville Dam facilities, just to kind of provide a general frame of context for everybody here, and then move into the comprehensive needs assessment overview. So what we're going to cover is just a discussion of the facilities, the risks and benefits associated with the facilities. So the Oroville Dam facilities, were originally kind of considered nearly 100 years ago as part of some of the statewide planning efforts that were going on at that time. And then after World War II, there was a lot of growth in California, and so in the early 50s, there was kind of a relook at statewide water supply, and in 1951, a report was made to the legislature by the state engineer at the time to take a detailed look for the planning of the facilities here in Oroville. They were envisioned and built to be multi-purpose dam and reservoir with the focus on flood control and water supply, as you guys have talked about, but also recognizing there are the other benefits that can be provided by a lake such as this. The planning was authorized by the legislature in 1951. And then shortly thereafter, in 1955, the largest flood of record at the time occurred in northern and central California. It resulted in the loss of 64 lives and about $200 million in property damage along the Feather River system. That really prompted the legislature to secure emergency appropriation to start the construction of the Oroville Dam facilities. So flood control was really one of the drivers for these facilities besides water supply. After that 1955 flood event, some of the key things that happened were the passage of the Burns-Porter Act in 1958 and then approved by the voters in 1960, which authorized $1.75 billion to build the state water project and the facilities here in Oroville. And then another key point to that is that efforts were going on to get the federal funding for the flood control component of the project. In 1962, Congress authorized the flood control component of the project and at a rate of about 22% of the overall project cost here for Oroville Dam. So I think we already hit upon the multiple benefits: flood control, water supply, of course, power, and then there's environmental benefits and recreation as well. So on the flood control side, the funding and Congress authorization for flood control in the project provided an annual reservation of 750,000 acre-feet for flood control, and that was intended, with studies at the time to protect to maintain releases at a maximum of 150,000 cubic feet per second for what was, calculated to be the standard project flood, which was an event on the order of a 450-year return period. And then another goal of the flood control studies were to maintain the maximum flows at the confluence of the Yuba and Feather River to 300,000 CFS or less. It also requires coordinated operations between the Feather River system and the Yuba River system through the Corps of Engineers and Yuba County Water Agency. So construction on the dam, proceeded in the early 60s, and just a few years after construction started, there was a major flow event on the Feather River. It peaked at about 250,000 CFS, and so even while the dam was being built, there was a realization of the flood control benefit in that these flows were attenuated and helped to reduce the downstream impacts related to to the inflow on the Feather River. And then similarly, we've talked about these events, but there was the, subsequent to the 60s event in 86, large inflows, 97 large inflows, and then last year, high inflows that the dam really helped to attenuate and take the peak off to keep the flows within the Feather River or the levee system downstream. And then others have hit upon the water supply component of the project. It is, very significant, and as the sheriff said, a huge benefit to the broader state. The water that's delivered out of the project goes to 29 contracting agencies, from northern to southern California, and provides a big benefit and to the residents of California. Plus, helps to irrigate farmland throughout the state as well. Power is also another benefit of the project. Hyatt Power Plant has 6 turbines in it and generates on the order of 1,600 gigawatt hours of power for use in the state as well. The project, when it was built, considered the environmental effects that it would have, and so there were some mitigations measures included with the project. Fish hatchery was built, to help sustain the fish population. And then the intake structure for Oroville Dam included, a gated structure that allowed, different release of temperature of water to help maintain the temperatures for the downstream fishery. So those were some measures that were included in the original construction. And under the relicensing process, there's a host of environmental mitigation measures that are planned to be enacted in the future. And this map just illustrates those, and wasn't planning to go through those in any detail, but just point out that there's some additional environmental projects that are planned in the future. The lake also, under the water code, is a state recreation area. And so as a result, there's a pretty, good and robust development of recreation facilities on the lake to, provide opportunity for folks to recreate. Then was going to maybe just touch a little bit upon the public safety, considerations for the project. Obviously, a project such as Lake Oroville provides the benefits we just discussed, but there are inherent risks with a large water supply project like this. Last year's incident was an extreme example of that, but there are also other risks related to the project. Those are partially mitigated or mitigated through the flood control and dam safety regulatory framework that has been established that the project operates under, but also through the application of, in this case, DWR's maintenance assessment programs. And so the comprehensive needs assessment is, as we've talked about today, is really an example of a program intended to mitigate the risks of this project. So with that, I was going to turn it over to Sergio Escobar, who's going to talk a little bit more detail and provide an overview of the comprehensive needs assessment.
Thank you, Ted.
Sergio begins his presentation.
Oh, I guess I have the... Well, basically the project need is to identify measures to restore and improve as necessary the safety and reliability of Oroville Dam and pertinent structures. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a series of workshops that, we're going to do PFMAs, we're going to do risk analysis, and additional workshops to look at what we're going to do as part of this project comprehensively.
What's a PFMA?
Potential failure mode analysis.
Thank you. Acronyms, maybe not everybody.
So some of the anticipated outcomes are to prioritize the dam safety and operational reliability, and provide these recommendations to DWR executive, have them do an evaluation of what we're going to recommend. And I think as was mentioned earlier, throughout the process, there may be some projects that we consider low-hanging fruit. So those projects, we will certainly initiate those process or projects and go through the regular regulatory process. So in other words, we would prepare plan specifications and go through FERC and DSOD to obtain their approvals before we initiate those projects. So I guess I touched on the next slide or next point. Now, with respect to reservoir operations, the CNA is going to look at reservoir operations, but it's going to be limited to short-term and look at what projects, projects that we move forward with. Those are going to be incorporated into flood control. With respect to flood control, the Corps of Engineers, they're essentially the lead agency for that. So DWR will be working closely with the Corps of Engineers to do any updates to the flood control manual. Some of the benefits, obviously the most important benefit is to maintain public safety and infrastructure, reduce flood risk, and provide continued environmental and recreational benefits that Ted talked about earlier. So these are the 6 tasks that have been identified. As was mentioned earlier, the IRB recommended a 7th task, and they had other recommendations. We are actively incorporating their recommendations, as of today. So I'm going to, at a very high level, touch on each task. In your binders, there should be additional PowerPoint presentation or slides that go in a little bit further into the details. So with respect to the first task, obviously what we want to do is ensure that we restore the original design capacity of the facility to pass the probable maximum flood. So that's at a very high level, that's task 1. Task 2 is the operation needs assessment, and I touched on this a little bit just a while ago. So under this task, there'll be some interim operations that are going to be coordinated with the Corps of Engineers. And as we move forward or through the process of the CNA, those projects would be incorporated into what would be the final or future operations manual. The task number 3 is the enhanced reliability of the existing gated structure, the flood control outlet. This particular item, there were a series of recommendations made by the Part 12D 9th Board. This process was actually initiated way in advance of last year's incident. We are looking at attendance, we're looking at the gates, we're looking at the just the structure from seismic stability. So HDR is helping DWR with some of these recommendations. So that's task number 3. The low-level outlet. The low-level outlet we are going to do an analysis of the mechanical, electrical system of not only the low-level outlet, but also in Hyatt. So it'll be a complete system of how do we get water out of the reservoir.
Just to clarify, you're talking about the river valve outlet system there, you're not talking about a potential third low-level outlet system, or essentially another spillway or a much expanded river valve outlet system.
Task one is where we're going to be looking at improving the emergency spillway or adding a secondary spillway. The task four, we will be looking at add a new or larger low-level outlet system.
Which now is the river valve outlet system and the powerhouse.
That is correct.
So you're looking at two things: improving operation of existing facilities and a potential low-level outlet for early releases.
That is correct.
Well, that's also in task one too.
That's separate, right? That's separate.
Yeah. I thought I had something.
We're looking at big, broad bullets here, and we're not looking at your sub-bullets. And so, but it's, you know, it's an interesting group, so we're going to interrupt from time to time.
It's perfectly fine. The fifth task is also a task that started in 2016, and it's also there were a series of recommendations that were made by the Part 12D board. This one is where we're going to look at one of the comments that was made, the green spot. There are probably a dozen recommendations related to that task. And again, like I said, the more detailed information is included in your binders. So this particular one, we'll look at dam stability, all of the recommendations that the Part 12D board made. Additionally, as part of the CNA, because we wanted to make this comprehensive, we're going to look at the interaction between the monoliths, that's the concrete part of the structure, and where the earth embankment come together, and the two saddle dams that are part of the system. And lastly, instrumentation and monitoring. There were a number of piezometers that were part of or used to analyze the dam as it was being constructed. Some of these piezometers are no longer working, so we're going to take a look into whether we need to reestablish some of these or not. The other component that we're going to do an analysis on is, are we going to cause more harm or put the dam at risk if we start punching a bunch of holes in the dam? So that's part of the work that's going to take place here, and the other part is basically updating the instrumentation. We currently have a series of prisms to monitor now. This task is going to look at not only the spillway, the dam, but we're also going to look at the powerhouse, the entire facility, and instrument it and monitor. The approach that we're taking on this, we're treating this as a planning study. So under a typical planning study, there's normally 4 phases. The phase 1 is to identify problems, set objectives, constraints, and opportunities. Phase 2 is to do an inventory of not only historical but current conditions and forecast future conditions. Once we've done those first two phases, then there's going to be some plans that are going to get formulated. The last item, it'll be a plan evaluation and do some comparisons, and also draft the draft and final reports. This is a high-level work plan schedule. We see the 4 phases there. So the current projection for completion of this project is December 31st of next year. So as Joel mentioned, this is a high priority project for him, so it's got a very aggressive schedule. I'm going to touch a little bit on the independent review board. So the role of the board is to provide independent review, comments, recommendations to DWR on the approach, content, and execution of the task, and final and draft reports. As you guys have in your handouts, and Assemblyman Gallagher has read through the first IRB report, they're very detailed. They're experts in that field. So one of the things that I would like to do, I know we did a round of introductions, but I would like to give an opportunity to the board to basically share with you their experience and backgrounds, both professional and academia. By the way, this is Bruce Mahler. He's the chair.
All right, thanks, Sergio. Maybe I'll just ask the board members, we'll all come and stand up in front so that nobody has their back to us as we talk a little bit about our backgrounds. I'll start off. I worked for 39 years for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Started off as a design engineer for 21 years, designing dams, spillways, outlet works. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the types of issues that you're dealing with here. For the last 18 years of my career, I dealt in basically risk management, organizational management, developing people for leadership positions, and program management. When I retired, I was the director of security, safety, and law enforcement. Basically, I had responsibility for all of the physical risk management programs, including dam safety, security, law enforcement, occupational health and safety, and emergency management for reclamation. I had a program of about $120 million a year that we were investing in trying to buy down risk for reclamation. Probably about 60 to 70% of that was actually spent on capital improvements to dams. I think the probably most notable of the projects that we worked on was the joint federal project down at Folsom Dam, where we actually put together a consortium between the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation to be able to essentially do what was billed as 2 separate projects, one for flood control, one for dam safety, that would have cost $2.3 billion. And through value engineering, actually we're able to figure out how to accomplish both of those objectives for $1.3 billion. So anyway, much of my career has been all about trying to figure out how to achieve dam safety objectives with a very reasonable approach, very much a risk management approach, and was responsible for implementing a fully risk-based approach to dam safety decision-making within the Bureau of Reclamation.
Hi, I'm Betty Andrews, or Elizabeth Andrews. I have been working in private industry for the last 28 years or so with a focus in flood management and also in looking for opportunities to accomplish river management that addresses public safety needs at the same time as helping to enhance the aquatic environment and community amenities that come from our river systems. I started out with a degree from an engineering school in a program that was engineering and policy. My perspective has always been that engineering has a lot of implications for our communities and for the way that we interact with those systems, and it's important to understand all sides of that. I spent a few years working for an NGO, actually Friends of the River, which is where Ron Stork has continued to work, and then went back to grad school, got a graduate degree in civil engineering at UC Davis, and since then have been working as a registered civil engineer in the state of California, where I've had an opportunity to work on a lot of river management related issues, some related to reservoir operations, but really taking the systems perspective. I've had an opportunity to work on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan effort. Have done some work in the San Joaquin Valley, less involved in the Sacramento system, but have some background that I bring to that, having had an opportunity to engage in the Yuba Feather Work Group in the early 2000s and some of the major systems issues that have confronted California, the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, the Yuba Accord, some of those systems operations advances that we've been able to make in the state. I'm really excited about the opportunity to work with this committee and with DWR and with the Independent Review Board to make some progress here. Thank you.
My name is Paul Schweiger, and I'm a private consultant. I've been working on dams for over 30 years now. I manage the Dams and Hydraulics Group for Gannett Fleming. That's the firm that I represent. And I manage a group of about 40 engineers. All we do is work on dams. I focused my career on dams, and my area of specialty is primarily spillways and hydraulics and things like that. I'm very interested in teaching the next generation on current standards for dam engineering. It's something, you know, the days of big dam building were in the 60s. And since that time, we've been designing fewer and fewer dams. So there's an urgent need to train the next generation on what is the state of the practice and for dams and things like that. I'm the lead instructor and developer of two seminars that are being taught nationally. One is lessons learned from dam failures and incidents, and the other one is inspection and assessment of dams. And those have become very popular seminars, and they're offered about twice a year. I'm also on the board for the recovery project, spillway recovery project. So I help act as a liaison between that board and this board.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. I'm Lelio Mejia. I'm with Geosyntic Consultants. I lead Geosyntic's dams and levees practice in the country. I'm a civil engineer. I've been working in dam engineering for the last 35 years, more than 35 years, working primarily in improving the safety of dams. In California, I worked on a number of projects in retrofits of projects in the Sierras and also in the coast of California, and then elsewhere throughout the nation, both in the West Coast and the East Coast and internationally. I've served on a number of these types of boards before. In fact, I've done quite a bit of work when Bruce was at the Bureau of Reclamation for reclamation. And for other federal programs, I was assisting the Secretary of Veterans Affairs on structural safety of veterans facilities for a number of years. And have also participated, or I'm a member, actually still a member of the Part 12 Board of Consultants, an independent consultant for the FERC Part 12, the safety inspection of the Oroville facilities. And so I bring that liaison into this process. Like my colleagues, I am very excited to be part of this process. I think it's a challenging task. I'm ready to meet the challenge and to work with all of you in making the Oroville facilities safer and serve the community better and the state better. Thank you.
Well, thank you, board.
Board members sit down.
So as you can see, they're pretty diverse but complementary to one another's experience. Our plan is to have a 5-member panel. The independent water systems operations expert, we were unable to come to terms, contractual terms, so we are actively seeking for that 5th member. That member, basically what we're looking for is somebody that brings the owner experience, how to operate the systems and what have you. So that was the conclusion. I guess we'll open up to questions if we have some time.
I have a few questions.
A microphone is passed to Assemblyman Gallagher.
So it's been discussed a few times that FERC and DSOD are also part of this process, right? They have to be involved in the CNA.
That is correct.
How can this group engage with them? And is there a plan for how that would be done with what their feedback is on this process?
I think that's the Joel.
You know, we hadn't explored or talked about that, Assemblyman Gallagher. I mean, I think our feeling was that nothing is going to be going to FERC until the process of having the board come explain recommendations, get feedback, and go back. And then after all that is done, they would be, that's where all the correspondences would really happen, the formal. Now, they are involved in the meetings that we have up front. They're there listening to what we're talking about. But really, it's to not slow down the process. We didn't want them to not be involved, and then at the end, they get this report, and they have a lot of questions, so we've embedded them to be in those. I hadn't really thought about that, how that could play out, so maybe we could put that on the board, and we could talk a little more, but.
Well, I would just put the recommendation, like, if there's stuff that comes up in these meetings where FERC is giving you some feedback, or DSOD is giving you some feedback,
in these discussions, that would get reported back to this group, so we kind of know if there's issues being raised. Is one thing I would request. All the recommendations that are in this technical memo, there's several, there's many of them. Are those all being accepted by DWR in its process?
Those are currently being worked on, or they were initiated in 2016, so prior to the incident. Simple answer is
no.
yes.
I mean the recommendations from the IRB in their technical memo.
Yes.
They have a list of them, right? Are those all being accepted by DWR
Yes,
in
they
their
are.
planning process?
Yes, they are.
Okay. You mentioned there was one section where you said DWR management will review recommendations. Are those recommendations from the IRB?
Those recommendations, so as we go through the process, each task is going to have a series of measures. These measures, now going back to task 7, so all these measures would be combined to come up with alternatives. And those are, the alternatives are in essence the recommendations.
And who reviews that at DWR management? Is that Joel?
That would be.
Who are the people that are going to be reviewing those recommendations, I guess?
I mean, the way we're structured right now, and these are some of the changes we've made, is, we've elevated Mr. Sarkeesian as the manager over dam safety. We've also elevated Ted as an assistant deputy director, basically an executive over dam safety day to day. And then there's a steering committee made up of our division chiefs, so Dave Duvall, O&M, Jeannie Cuddle, Division of Engineering. So these recommendations would come out of the team, go through the technical steering committee, more experts at DWR. They weigh in on that. If they agree with the recommendations, it eventually goes up to myself and Ted for, agreement. And they're the experts. I'm not a civil engineer. That's why we have a lot of experts. They weigh in, I weigh in on the decision. Then that decision that the department makes is what gets vetted and presented to the IRB. And then the IRB will make their recommendations and presentations to you guys on, just explaining the recommendations and any feedback there.
So can we, so my response to that, can we
Also know what recommendations were made to management and what the response was from management out of those? Is that something that can be reported back to the body?
I think what you're asking, is if there's 5 alternatives, that you guys get to see all 5 alternatives plus the alternative that we've selected. Is that what you're
Right.
asking?
Yeah. I think what we want is just transparency to the group on what the decision of management was with regard to those recommendations.
I think, and I'll ask Ted, but I think the process is going to be, I would be looking at whatever those alternatives are, and the recommendation, you guys would also see the alternatives that were looked at and the one that was selected as the most, as the best option.
Right, and a rationale for why.
That'll be in the report that the experts write, not, I wouldn't say it would be Carla or myself coming up with that rationale, but it's really an engineering risk decision-making rationale.
Right. And I'm not well versed in all this stuff, but I know, that's all right. I know from the report there was something about, like, even in deciding what alternatives you study, you kind of need to have a process to figure out what are the right alternatives to study, right? Is that something that, it sounds like you guys are adopting these recommendations, so that's something that you plan to do?
Yes, and I think you're asking a little bit deeper into what the teams would be doing, because that's where they'll be doing the risk-informed decision-making process, which is looking at what are the options, what are the risks, and then making a decision based on that. And that,
right,
the teams would be doing that.
I guess what I'm getting at is just if the team that's down in the weeds on this is making recommendations and somehow management disagrees with that recommendation, I want this body to know about it and why. Does that seem reasonable? Just so that we can at least know that and have and maybe the ability to discuss it. Is that?
Yeah,
okay?
I think that's going to be what we're counting on the board, really, to be, if they believe that the team recommended something and DWR management had a different decision, they're going to be reporting on that and then also reporting on their recommendation on that decision.
Joel, could I add a little to that?
Yeah.
And I think, the way this is structured with the quarterly meetings is really intended as we kind of work through the process. It allows kind of the level of input and deliberation you're talking about, Simlin and Gallagher, to occur. So I think the fact that we're holding these meetings regularly will be good, because it's going to allow us to share as we're developing these various tasks where we're at.
And then kind of related to that, we mentioned earlier, does cost consideration of the cost of an alternative or a project that might be identified, does that become a consideration at all in this process?
I think, the department, like any organization, is going to prioritize based on risk and resources. So I wouldn't say that cost is going to be the driver of any decision, but it's just information that's used, because ultimately we need to manage within the resources we have and the time and the engineering resources available to do the project. So it is not going to be a driver of this one costs more than this, so we're going to take a less safe or approach. It's going to be, this is the cost. Here's all the recommendations that the projects are making, because there's going to be many. And we're going to have to prioritize all those based on risk and, which ones we're going to do from year 1 to year 20, however long it takes to get all this stuff done. So if you frame it that way, there will be a prioritization. Cost will not be the driver overriding public safety or the reliability of the system, but it is information that's used to plan out projects from here till, you know, as we keep updating the facility.
Right. And then last one, is on the FCO review. I heard kind of looking at that long-term reliability, sustainability, FCO. Will part of that include a review of the head? And I heard you talk about the anchor rods and the gates. Will it also include a review of the headworks, including that, the competency of the rock underneath the headworks?
Short answer is yes. It'll look at the entire complex. This facility was also constructed back in the early 60s where seismic was, 0.1 G. That was the requirement. Seismic today is like close to 0.6 G. So it's going to be comprehensive. As part of the ongoing construction, we were able to see the rock adjacent to it. There are plans to do some core holes within the structure itself. So it's thorough.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that you got to where, you know why I'm going there, is because we have discovered since then, hey, there are
weathered rock areas that we didn't know about before, or that we, now have since discovered, hey, there's some other issues here. And I think what you answered, yeah, we are going to look into that to make sure that we can be confident, hey, this is really anchored on competent rock.
Yes.
And if not, then we got to have a plan to rehabilitate that, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, early on, we saw this as an opportunity when we were demolishing the top portion, and Ted coordinated the CNA and construction project so that when that got demolished, we would be looking at anchoring and the foundation and doing some coring down there, so we have that information is pulled up before we build on top of it. So that information's is being gathered now.
Can I follow up on that? And I'm really encouraged by this. One of the first questions I asked when this began, had there ever been much boring done? I used that term. That may not be the engineering proper term. But, what's going on underneath? We do a lot of that in the soil management and farming and whatever. Is the bedrock holding? Did the cement get down to bedrock? And when I saw that we were pouring cement down 100 feet, then it told me that we probably didn't then, but that, as you indicate, probably was standards at the time. Going forward, though, obviously you're going to be paying attention to that. I didn't see any reference here, and by the way, I really appreciate the members of the IRB signing the little protocol there. That was nice to have you put your own names on that, and that gives us a little bit of comfort. A lot of people don't want to take responsibility, and you've more than done that. Vegetation management, that is an issue, and is that going to be looked at as we proceed? Vegetation management. We had to remove a bunch of trees at the end of the spillway to start the whole process, and that, the spillways are not habitat. And then, of course, we had some problems in the drains with roots. So I'm sure that you're looking at that, but I just wanted to inquire. Has that been on the radar screen?
Yeah, I can comment on that, Senator Nielsen, a little bit in terms of the spillway construction. As we've, as you said, cleared a lot of the vegetation to build the spillway, and so the final operation and maintenance, document that'll describe how that facility is operated in the future will set limits on the clearing that needs to occur in the future away from the spillway. And then additionally, under our typical kind of dam safety maintenance practices, we also have vegetation management programs in place. Sergio, maybe you could share whether that's something that will be contemplated as part of the CNA or covered in one of the embankment tasks. I think in terms of the assessment of the green spot, that's included in that analysis.
Or in the emergency spillway, because we know that emergency spillway had lots of vegetation on it, as we're thinking about how that's going to operate potentially in the future, is that something that goes into the CNA?
I would, yeah, think definitely so, because ultimately we're looking at an option to get back to the PMF capacity of the spillway system, whatever, whether it's a separate structure, extension of the emergency spillway, so yes.
Going forward, the inspection protocols, will that include then something to do some boring or some examination underneath the spillway, see if the grouting's holding and is there any deterioration in the bedrock, or are we going to look underneath, in other words? That's the point.
Well, maybe I'll talk in terms of the work we're currently doing and then turn it over to either Sergio or David Sarkisian regarding our dam safety work that's going on. The current spillway, we've basically excavated it down to competent rock and have done an extensive geologic investigation program of the site. So there there won't be as much of a need for the new structure to do investigation. However, we are conducting investigations, as we've talked about, of the headwork structure. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Dave Sarkisian to talk about some of the investigative work that's planned.
Yeah, so we've, the reconstruction of the spillway really created some opportunities for us to learn more about the flood control outlet structure up top that houses the gates. So during construction, we were able to obviously inspect the bedrock that was exposed. Blasting was required up there. The excavators with the hoe rams on them to get the grade we needed for the new spillway. We actually tested some of the existing old anchors for the old spillway chute, and they tested quite well. We've been able to look at some of the drains that go under the FCO. So we've been able to kind of validate some of the assumptions or inputs to stability analyses through these investigative efforts. In terms of like inspection of our spillway beyond November 2018, I think it'll be probably task 6 that's kind of instrumentation and monitoring focused. That task will need to really capture all the things we're going to do in the future for that new spillway. So things like inspecting the new drains, and there's miles and miles of drains. The visual inspections, any non-destructive testing, the prisms that Sergio mentioned. We've got all sorts of new survey and technologies we can apply to assess the performance of that spillway moving forward. And that sort of approach will need to be taken on any new facility that we end up designing or building out there, is to get a more robust inspection program applied and use modern technologies. So that's the direction we're heading. And so hopefully that addresses the question.
That's very encouraging. Thank you.
I'd like to bring up a couple of things. One, I saw that the chairman had participated in the FOSUM, and one of the things that the FOSUM does is a more integrated approach to looking ahead at the weather forecasting and things like that. And here on this one, we seem to be already committed to the step function linear type of flood management approach. And I was wondering if there was any consideration to using this integrated forward-looking, I mean, the patterns have changed, so has the technology for accessing, weather patterns and stuff like that. And if that would be brought into the flood control rather than continuing with what I'll look at as a sort of step function linear approach to flood control that we have growing out of the 60-year-old, Army Corps of Engineer approach.
That's a great question. Maybe from the IRB, or is task 2, which is talked about operations.
I did a couple, 2 more.
Right, and then Larry has some more. Is that going to include a review of whether or not we should do forecast-based operations?
So I think we'll certainly look at what DWR comes up with in the way of recommendations. I think what I would just caution you on a little bit is that the flood control manual for Folsom is a long way from being done. And there's not necessarily 100% agreement within the Corps of Engineers as to how much you can rely on forecast-based information. And so they're still going through a process of trying to figure out what gives reliable risk management. Because quite honestly, how you develop your flood control plan can emphasize conservation of water, can emphasize flood control, and it's these kinds of processes that help reach a balance between those. There's never going to be a system that can universally provide absolute flood control and absolute water supply. There'll be a trade-off that will be reached. I just don't, it's going to take them a while to get there before they have a final flood control manual.
Larry did have a couple other questions, I think.
Well, I was just going to respond to that. I thought I was in fairly close touch with SAFCA on the flood control manual. The Corps expected the flood control manual for Folsom to be in place for the 2017 flood season. Didn't make it, but kind of informally said, if we need to, we'll operate to that flood control manual. The flood control manual is a forecast influenced manual. It relies on river forecasts coming out of the National Weather Service River Forecast Center to do a portion of the flood control manual. There is a complicated manual, more complicated than this one is, but at least as I understand it, they intend to be finished for the 2018 season. That's a kind of a first step. There'll be a second manual revision when the dam raise and some of the final components of the physical infrastructures are changed. So they've changed the gates, and now they're going to be having forecast influenced operations. If you're thinking it from the reclamation perspective, as well as perhaps my perspective, I'd say that is a conservative operation. The Corps, I think, is more conservative than reclamation. So from that perspective, I think reclamation and I agree that the Corps is conservative, but the Corps is still moving ahead with a forecast influenced operation. And I suspect that DWR will be, and Joel just told us it's part of the CNA, when you're thinking about making recommendations for this manual, that you will be making some recommendations about forecast influenced operations, since, as you noted, we have satellites now and sophisticated computers, and we can do a better job at that than we did in the 60s. That said, the farther away you get from the ocean, the more difficult forecast influenced operations are, because you have to chase that water all the way through the flood system. But that said, we're not that far. It's not that long a distance to get through the Feather, through the Yodel bypass, so I'm optimistic that the department can do a better job in its revised flood control manual if it puts its shoulder to the wheel.
So that's all good background on forecast-based operations and what's going on at Folsom, but I think the crux of the question was to DWR, is forecast-based operations part of the CNA? Is it part of the review under task number 2, which I think is where it would be the best portion, yes or no? It should be.
Yeah, I'll talk to it a little bit, Assemblyman. So task 2 is kind of the integration of, the spillway look, the outlet look, how do those operate together? and then they have to operate as a system. And then we also have the flood control manual update process that we plan to start. That the outcome of this work would then feed into that work, so there'd be integration among those efforts.
Right, but so would that include a consideration of whether or not we want to try to move to forecast-based operations or not?
Yeah, our intention is to move in that direction. The Corps of Engineers is the federal lead agency, so there would be interaction.
I mean, I'm just saying for this body, I mean, you're kind of making recommendations, right? You might ultimately decide, no, we don't want to go that route, and this is why, right? But I'm just saying, is it going to be part of the mix of considerations?
Yeah, the current plan is to move in that direction.
In the CNA?
I think the CNA operation approach is focused on how the facilities will function together, and then the flood control process is another process. But I think that fundamental point of using that is kind of embedded in the overall process.
So yes, it is part of the CNA or not? I guess that's just what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think this.
I would think it would have to be, because if you're going to consider the manual, which is part of task 2 as I understand it, part of that is forecast-based operations, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think task 2 is focused on how the facilities that are recommended, or the alternatives that come out of task 1, task 4, and I'm maybe mixing up my tasks a little bit, so apologize, but how will those could operate into the flood control system? And so there's a subtle distinction there that I'm probably not articulating the best, but I think what we learned from doing that, the update of the flood control manual would be integrated. So there's integration from that perspective, assembly person.
How about, I mean, from Sergio or maybe from the IRB, do you guys anticipate this being part of those considerations in task 2?
Some of these items, as I mentioned, are really part of the other effort, the coordination with the Corps of Engineers. So the updating of the flood control manual, that's a different process. So CNA, like Ted mentioned, is going to look at the facilities and how they operate with one another. Forecast based or other items such as that, I think that's a different process.
It's a different, I totally get that it's a different process from the standpoint that if we decide to go totally redo the manual or do a modification of the manual, you got to go through the Corps to do that. I get that, right? That's a core process. But in terms of considering the infrastructure and operations, which is task number 2, right? One of the things you might recommend out of the CNA is, hey, we need to update the manual, or we need to, and as part of that, maybe move to forecast-based operations. So that's what I'm saying is the recommendation. There's going to be a whole process you have to go through to get there if you decide to go that route. But I mean, is the decision to go that route in the CNA?
Steve Varian, and I think you've all said it, and what it will, the progression of the work will be that we'll be looking at combinations of spillways and low-level outlet infrastructure capability. And so then the operations group will, I'm projecting here some, but throughout the recovery, they've run scenario after scenario and done a lot of scenario work to manage the reservoir to not spill through the last year. And so they'll do that same type of work through the CNA, looking at these alternatives for different combinations of infrastructure. And then I think that they will be able to advise that with these new facilities or with these alternate facilities and operations plans, you'll have different capabilities to manage the reservoir differently to move forward into a forecast-based operations plan, and then that would go into the core process that you're talking about.
Hypothetically,
If there are no physical changes to the project that are recommended by all of us, these three groups here today, during that process, does that mean that DWR does not expect that there'll be a need to revise the manual?
I don't think so, Ron. I think that the sort of as-is alternative would still have DWR looking at the flood control manual, but that, as you know, involves new bullards and system-wide considerations.
Yeah, in fact, I even have New Bullard's manual with me today.
Yeah.
And I know it well. But it seems to me that I thought the charge of the CNA would be to take a look at not only physical infrastructure improvements, presumably to make sure that the project functions as intended, and also to look at whether or not design improvements be made, because there may be a need for more than just the 1960s design for the project. And then the kind of the third item would be at least the flood control manual operations. And obviously, if you make physical changes that meaningfully improve your ability to conduct flood operations, or change it in some ways, that needs to be reflected back in the manual. But at least in my long discussions with the department has thought for at least a couple decades that it might be time to revise this 1970s area manual. And I thought the CNA, part of the charge of the CNA would be to make whatever recommendations the department and the IRB and others, including this group, think are a good idea.
I think that's right. I think that's the intention, that the operations task will provide advisory recommendations on what can be done for the future manual.
Okay, thank you.
Let me pipe in on that too, because that is a big issue. It's come to the public's attention many times in many ways in many different dams. But I think that this is a big issue, Laura, is it not, for Congressman LaMalfa? He's always talking about this level of management. So I think going ahead, this is certainly going to have to be a consideration. And, you know, I don't see you saying yes, but it seems like there's a process going, and that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on, because it's going to be very important as far as I'm concerned. And I think I speak for Congressman LaMalfa on that, don't I?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, just to come back, there's many drivers from different parts of the committee that would like to see that looked at. And obviously, our recreational driver is that, you know, lower lake levels is an easy answer, but, you know, while there's still plenty lake at lower lake levels, the access is greatly diminished once you go below 800. You go from 40 lanes of access to less than 10. So that's what a driver is on being a more sophisticated, integrated projection so that we can have better control. A second issue I had wanted to ask is that, I don't know if I'm the only one, but if there's anyone else on the committee that has not taken a tour to actually look at the facilities, be able to talk better about them, I'm one, and I'd like to see if that could be arranged at some point.
Yeah, that is, I think that's a good request. That is something that we're going to take back and see if there's a way we can do that, to bring a group out to have some look at the facilities.
And finally, I just wanted to assure them that in one of the things that we've always talked about, like when Sandy was at the chamber, is that as we try to go back and reestablish the reputation that our community and the downstream communities are a safe place to live, work, and play, is that one of the major products we have to sell is that there is trust in the organization that operates the dam, and that this is a safe place to work, live, and play. And so we want that product, that trust product, to be available to us to sell our community and that. And we hope that this is an outcome of this effort.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I really hope this is a step in that direction, and realize that's not something that happens immediately, but it is a process, so we really hope that's one of the things we get out of this process. I don't want to cut off questions, but we also have the IRB, and this would be a good time to give the IRB.
Okay, thank you, and good morning. Let's see, you're going to swap it out? All right. Let me first say that all of us on the IRB are very happy to be able to be a part of this. I think that, very good, thank you. What I'm going to do is just quickly summarize, and I'm going to make a couple of apologies to you. We don't have a printed copy of this for you just yet. I'm sure DWR will work on that for you. The other thing is you'll see the notation of the critical infrastructure information and do not release. It was just last night that we decided that because the report's been released, this doesn't contain anything that's not already in the report. So that label is not necessary on the bottom, but we didn't have a chance to get that cleaned up in advance. So don't feel like this is something that you can't do anything with. First of all, what we'd like to do, IRB members, you've got some introductions. We'll skip that. Share with you some general observations that we had from the first meeting, and then kind of go over with you the specific recommendations that we made, and I'll try to do that as expeditiously as possible to then allow you to have questions or delve into issues that are particularly of interest to you. So the IRB members, you've met the four of us now. General observations. So I think keep in mind that this was the first meeting of the IRB. I think it was the first time that the four of us have had an opportunity to work together. I think it was, while I've known Paul and Lelio for quite some time, it was my first opportunity to meet and work with Betty. So some of it was us getting used to each other and how are we going to share information with each other? How are we going to draw some conclusions? How are we going to make recommendations? I think one of the things that you'll see from us, it's our sincere desire that our recommendations be something that helps DWR be successful in carrying out this CNA. And that it helps them establish the trust that all of you are looking for. I think that's kind of a combination that's absolutely necessary for good water resources management. And I think some of the discussion around the table today has been very encouraging. Certainly, Oroville Dam benefits numerous people. I was really happy to hear Laura's comments about it goes beyond the state of California. The nation is the consumer of the fruits and vegetables that come out of California. And internationally, it's a major export. So these are things that we need to keep in mind, that this isn't just a local issue. There is interest throughout the nation in this. Certainly, we talked a little bit about the need to kind of do a preliminary risk assessment to find out, are there some issues that really require some expedited action? Obviously, the first one is the repair of the existing spillway. That was left in a state that it was simply not operable and had to absolutely have immediate action to be brought back into service. What we need to do is, we have a recommendation in here, we need to kind of take that look everywhere. Make sure that there's not some sort of other smoking gun out there that requires some sort of quick action similar to that. I don't believe we've seen anything in our first meeting that would indicate that's out there. However, we haven't had the teams go through and do that look to make sure that we've talked to people. And quite honestly, if there is a smoking gun, somebody in the organization already knows it and just hasn't had the opportunity to speak up. And so I think that's been kind of our encouragement, is be sure that people are talking. Some of you have heard rumors and things like that. Share what those are. You know, if you've heard something, share it, and let's get to the bottom of it and give DWR the opportunity to address those issues. I think that DWR has really appropriately initiated an effort to comprehensively consider all of the aspects. And quite honestly, I think as a board, we were quite impressed with the teams that have been put together. For our board meeting, they actually brought in all of the team leads for each of the 6 tasks. Very highly qualified people, people who understand risk management, who understand the technical issues associated with all of these tasks to be done. I would say the one thing we did notice from an overall perspective is that there's a need to integrate things because the 6 tasks have considerable overlap with each other. There is a lot of interdependencies in those tasks, and that was the reason for our recommendation of a 7th task that would really be that project management piece that looks at it in an integrated fashion. Now, it may be that DWR, that's just part of their project management process. Our recommendation is just let's be explicit about it, whether it's a separate task or not, but let's be sure that we're explicitly doing that project management to get that integration. Specific recommendations. So in general, we think the CNA is well conceived and very well planned. Obviously, we're right at the beginning. One of the things that DWR did for us as part of our first meeting was to take us on that tour that I think Larry was talking about, to actually see the facilities and get a hands-on feel for the complexity of this particular facility. I think it is, I don't want to say mind-boggling, but there is a lot of complexity to the operations. And certainly it's appropriate, the CNA is an appropriate effort to assure safety and reliability as a key water resource. Okay, so the second question that we were asked is, does the CRB have any recommendations or comments on the DWR organization or the role of the IRB? This specific plan for execution of project integration and being able to map the interdependencies between the different tasks were the recommendations that we had there. Do we have any recommendations or comments on the strategy and the structuring of the CNA approach? First one is to do this comprehensive risk analysis. You can't identify whether or not there's some interim actions that need to be taken without doing some sort of an initial comprehensive risk assessment. So one of the things we noticed just as we looked at the project plans is that there were a couple of cases where the alternatives were being developed before the criteria for how the alternatives would be evaluated had been developed. And not that anybody consciously decided this. I think this was more an artifact of how things were conveniently arranged. I think the thing that we saw is from this trust perspective, it would create, it could create the appearance of pre-selecting or selecting your alternative, or if you select your alternative first, then to establish the criteria, it might look like you establish the criteria in order to justify the alternative that you want to implement. And so we encouraged them to reorder some of those tasks so that there would be a credible establishment of criteria right up front. I think one of the things that absolutely has to be done is spend some time documenting what's working well. We all tend to get focused on solving problems, and quite honestly, as an engineer, it's what I was trained to do. Identify a problem, solve the problem. But the reality is, too many times in trying to solve a problem, we end up creating a new problem that we didn't think about because we didn't stop to think about what was working well and what do we not want to mess with and screw it up, quite honestly. So having some documentation of that, I think, would serve the project well going forward. The last one is just making sure that as we consider alternatives, that the evaluation considers what the gain or loss of benefits are. And we maybe said project benefits here. I'm thinking project in the big picture. And that includes public benefits, the secondary benefits, things like that, that at least identify where are the gains and losses from any particular alternative that's being considered. Whoops, let's go the right way here. All right, some other general things. Evaluate and document the existing project components for robustness, redundancy, reliability, and resiliency. And we give the Corps of Engineers definitions for each of those. They're critical things for dam safety, and they really come into play as you start to get into these complex mechanical and electrical and control systems. So there's lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. What we'd like to see is make sure that where we're highly dependent on a system to work, that we fully understand what's in place to make sure that it will work when called upon to work. Adopting the value planning approach, I think the Assemblyman mentioned his appreciation of seeing that. It's a highly effective way to develop alternatives. It really takes you back to deciding what your objectives are before you try to put alternatives together. And it has a very structured process that you go through for establishing what those objectives are and how you might brainstorm some alternatives to achieve those objectives. The last one there is to adopt a begin with the end in mind. And this is really more about trying to help DWR stay on track with their schedule. It's the idea of figure out what the final report looks like and lay that out, outline it, and figure out what are all the pieces that need to be inserted from the teams so that you can see what progress you're making along the way, and that everybody knows what it is and what piece it is and what role it fits as it goes into the final report on this study. I think the other thing is it would help you all kind of see what's going to come out in the end and begin to ask some questions early on as to, well, are you going to address this or are you going to address that? And then they can make adjustments to what that format looks like. Rather than waiting to the end and say, well, I didn't see this, and then it's a major effort to go back, recreate that, and do all the work to integrate it into all of the work that had previously been done. Some generally applicable recommendations using a common terminology. I think one of the things we noticed in the first meeting is some terms or some infrastructure has different terminology to refer to it, and it was just a little bit confusing to us as engineers. I can't imagine how confusing it may be to you from a layman's perspective when it comes to these facilities. So we've asked them to just go through and kind of decide on a common terminology like the flood control outlet, so that everybody knows exactly what they're talking about when they bring that up. Ensuring that quality management includes initial assignment of adequate resources to do the work. One of the things that was really well covered was each of the project plans had a section on quality management, but it was the kind of the the typical inspected in, how are we going to review it after the work has been done? But the reality is most of the quality gets built in by assigning the proper resources and adequate resources to do the work up front in the proper manner. The holistic approach to the evaluation of mechanical, electrical, and control systems, this very definitely includes the human element because people have to make decisions. They're going to be under certain pressures. And so we just need to know that everybody knows exactly what to do when, and that just because we say we need 150,000 out of the flood control outlet, that somebody doesn't decide, well, I'm going to open the right 2 gates because that's the fastest and easiest way to do it, when in fact that may actually spill the water out of the spillway because of the hydraulics. There are other considerations that have to go into the operations, and that needs to be documented so you don't have an operator who's unfamiliar with the structure, who may have just started working last month, out there trying to operate this thing and make decisions about how to achieve the task that's been given to them. Consider reliability of systems that deliver power to the grid. So what this is about is that the routing of floods through the reservoir absolutely relies upon the generation of power through the Hyatt plant. Well, the question then becomes, how reliable do we know the grid to be so that we know that we can deliver that power into the grid so that we can keep the turbines running? The flip side of that is to think about, is there something that could be built to just do nothing but consume and waste power so that if the grid is not online, we can just generate heat and consume that power on site so that we can keep the turbines running? So that is just something to think about in terms of a reliability perspective. And then finally, it's really just stating all of the assumptions that form the context of all of the assessments of risk. To me, this was the thing that we gained the most from at Reclamation, was the communication that takes place when you're trying to describe a risk assessment. Because everybody begins talking about their assumptions, and when people don't agree on what the assessment of risk is, then you begin comparing assumptions. And that is when the real learning begins to take place, and people end up with a better understanding of the systems. So task 1, these are fairly straightforward on all of these tasks, I think, but this one is really about revising the task title to more accurately reflect what we understood the objective to be, and then reassessing those downstream consequence thresholds to make sure that you're looking at the best current available information for being able to assess risk. Task 2 on the operational needs assessment, this is where we think that climate change needs to be taken into account. Whether or not climate change actually has an impact on extreme events like very large floods, I think the jury is still out on that. I think all we're asking DWR to do is at least document what their thinking is related to climate change at this point. Flood control outlet enhanced reliability, include a hydraulic performance assessment for various gate operations. This is really about being cognizant of how you choose to operate the gates may have impacts on how it performs hydraulically. And so in terms of setting up standing waves that may overtop the chute walls and things like that, just need to have a really good understanding of how, when you make different gate openings, how that's going to affect the flow coming out of that structure and heading down the chute. The low-level outlet, task 4. So one of the things that we didn't understand was what was driving the need, and a lot of what was driving the need was the inability to evacuate the reservoir, the lower half of the reservoir essentially, not in volume, but in terms of height of the dam. And so in the presentations, they walked us through that and showed that. We just asked them, why don't you put that in the scope document so that everybody has an understanding of what's driving the need to look at a low-level outlet. Then document and summarize the analysis and assumptions related to reservoir sedimentation. I think the indication to us was that reservoir sedimentation isn't a big issue at this particular facility. But our thought is, well, it's such a big issue at so many facilities that let's just document what information we know about it and why we believe it's not an issue that would drive decisions for this particular structure. And then assess project benefits that could be derived by enabling active management of the reservoir volume between elevations 350 and 640. So the magic thing about 350 and 640, I think, if I remember right, 350 is potentially what you could get down to if you were to tap through the existing low-level outlet directly into the reservoir rather than through the outlet intake. 640 is what they can actually draw down to at this time. And so you've got roughly, let's see, 290 feet of reservoir that could potentially be tapped and be used to provide project benefits overall, whether that's for the public or for water users or flood control. It's just additional reservoir storage that could potentially be brought to bear. Embankment reliability and improvements. So the Part 12 exam team made a number of recommendations. We're kind of leaving it to DWR to go through this process and address those recommendations. And we did not see anything beyond what has already been recommended by the Part 12 team to be addressed. And we didn't really have any recommendations in terms of the instrumentation and monitoring. We think that that's well conceived the way that it is. I think that's one that as we see more of the results, we'll take a better look at what it is that needs to be done there. But not much for us to review there at this point. And then finally, the last question we were asked is, does the IRB have any other recommendations or comments? Which we thought it was wise to ask this because it gives us the opportunity to look across the board. It's not like we're limited in the things that we can look at. And so the one thing that we thought would be good, it was not clear to us exactly why the 6 particular tasks that were chosen, why they were chosen. We think they're a reasonable set of tasks. But we thought it might be helpful if they were to just document what the basis was for selecting those 6 particular tasks. So with that, that is our report.
Questions?
Bruce waits for audience questions.
Loud, everybody.
It's a great team.
Well, I know we captured a lot of questions at the end of the Sergio and Ted's presentation. And, sure. And then we have time on the agenda. We are at 11 o'clock, but we did have time on the agenda, an item there for questions from the group for either the IRB or DWR. So I guess we should check and see if folks were. Arun? Yeah. Cheryl. Hand you the microphone.
Yeah, I don't know if we can pull up the last set of DWR slides. Phase 1 is inventory of conditions, and Phase 2 is identify objectives, constraints, and opportunities. Yeah. Which one's first?
Between Phase 1 and Phase 2, is that the question?
No, are you gonna, on one slide you're saying, first we're gonna go identify the problems, objectives, constraints, and opportunities, and then we're gonna do an inventory. On this slide here, you're saying we're gonna go do the inventory, and then we'll figure out the problems, constraints, opportunities.
Yeah. In reality, these Phase 1s and 2s are being done simultaneously, and this schedule is still a work in progress. The date we know we have committed to is the end date, and developing the work approach has taken us some time, and so phase 1 and phase 2 are underway, and they're being done together.
Okay.
Schedule says they're finished.
That's okay. There's as
And they're
envisioned,
not,
and
Ron.
there's what actually happens. So that would be a question. I mean, it probably would be nice, and I think the review board also pointed out that, hey, you should have an idea of what your screening criteria are, so when you do your inventory, you're picking up on all those aspects.
We
So it's
agree
kinda-
with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good recommendation.
Yeah, so kind of in line with that, when I look at our charge here, we're kind of a liaison to the public. And working in kind of the risk communication world, it's a challenging arena to be in. And I'm wondering if you guys are working on any sort of a summary, and it's kind of along the lines of the evaluation criteria. But when we talk about safety, when we talk about reliability, what do you mean? And can we come up with metrics that kind of communicate what it is that you're talking about? And I can give you an example in this room. So from a safety standpoint, I see signs above the door that say the occupant load of this room is 51. So if we're at 52 people, we're probably in unsafe conditions. So there's some indicator of what is okay and what is not okay. Is that being built into your process as you set up your risk assessments, as you do your screening criteria? And is that something that is going to be made available to the panel here so that we have some idea of what you consider safe, what you consider reliable?
Yes, and there are at least two ways to describe those, kind of the criterion process that we'll use. We'll have many of the statutory and the engineering established criterias that will have to be met for dam safety per the Corps of Engineers and those types of design criteria. Then we're also going to use a lot of risk-based approaches, so that we will be actually doing, we're planning right now, the first workshop that we have scheduled is for the end of this month. And we've worked our way toward, well, what level of risk assessment, what type of risk assessment are we going to use? And so we're going to have that meeting to actually further refine that, and what we intend to use is a semi-qualitative risk assessment where we'll actually do a baseline for the entire facilities, and then we'll be looking as we develop alternatives, how we're going to be lowering those risks to tolerable levels. So we'll have the deterministic type design criteria to meet, but we'll also have a risk-based approach to get down to the tolerable levels of risk that we think are advisable.
So just looking at the schedule here, we're middle of July in 2018, and it seems like most of 2019 is kind of oriented towards the plan formulation. If you start running out of time, how will you make up that time if you're still working on trying to figure out what the criteria are and doing the assessments, and we push into 2019? Would it be, nope, that's a hard deadline at the end of 2019, we get this thing done and we'll just work with what we have? Or would there be a reevaluation of the process to make sure that all of the important factors have been identified and incorporated in the study, and maybe that means you need to go another 6 months?
I think it won't be acceptable to the department or to FERC or DSOD to compromise the quality, and we'll try to make that schedule. And what will happen is we'll be pushing our technical work out over the tops of the developments of the draft report to the point that we can, and when we'll try to assess this early, and that slide used to be called the high-level schedule, and we made it a work plan as to not box ourselves in, because we know where we've got these time constraint issues. So I think before compromising quality, we would be seeking extensions, and the risk, the type of risk assessments that we want to do weren't completely envisioned at the very beginning of the project, and that might be reason to extend the schedule a bit.
Sure. So when we look up here on the slide, the phase 2, identify objective constraints and opportunities, right now, the vision is kind of end of August or something like that. Does that seem in line with what you're thinking, or is that going to get?
No, we can't. Well, a baseline risk assessment we think we can do. So that's existing conditions, and that may be in that late summer, early fall time frame. But the ongoing risk assessments, as we start weighing measures and then alternatives, those are going to be out into next year.
Okay, and I'm just asking the question because, again, those evaluation criteria and the metrics are kind of a way where we can communicate with the public and solicit their input and feedback on, hey, you know, like the occupant load, what do you think about 75 people? Is that too many, or should we go down to 25? Or just so there's something more tangible than the notion of safe and the notion of reliable.
Yeah, and we'll be building that work as the conversations were going on earlier about how is this group going to see the work. The way that I see that is we'll be doing incremental work. We'll be presenting that to the IRB. The IRB will be reviewing that work and commenting on it, so it's going to be daylighted to you, so you'll see the development of those criteria and the incremental milestones that we hit.
Okay, cool. And just one other, maybe more comment, but what happens in instances where, let's say, the review board comes up with a suggestion, like map all the interdependencies between all the different systems, and DWR is not in a position, either through its own internal knowledge or through the consortium of consultants that it has, to come up with an eloquent solution to that. Maybe it's too hard, or we don't know how to do it, it hasn't been done before. So more kind of new emerging ways to deal with things. Are there processes built in to kind of do research and development, if you will? So instead of saying, great comment, I don't know how to do it, so we'll put it off for the future. But great comment, see what you're saying, don't know how to do it, let me figure it out.
I don't think we've contemplated being there. I'm not sure that we could say today that we can absolutely avoid that, but I think we have an idea of the types of risk assessments and analyses we would be doing, and I think we have the capabilities to do those now, but we haven't thought about the possibility that you just posed.
Sure, so, and I don't want to speak for the entire board, but at least me personally would be willing, if you do find yourself in that situation where you're being asked to do something that you haven't done before, don't know how to do it, whatever, you know, let's roll up all of our sleeves and confront it, as opposed to saying, yeah, it's too hard, or I don't know what to do, we'll get back to it later.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I think we have, you know, through the recovery, and I've worked on the recovery project over the last year and a half too, we have always sought additional expertise where we found we needed it, and it has been done, as was mentioned earlier, differently than most projects because of the pace, and this project may have some of those similarities that we need more collaboration from those who would typically stand in review and take more time. So.
Sure, and just an observation. Production work, you know what to do, it's clear, you go out and get it done. Development work requires a little more thinking and head scratching. And so it's usually 3 to 4 times more than you originally think, both on budget and on schedule. Yeah. So if you're kind of working on something that's new, definitely allocate more time, definitely allocate more resources to that, because it's not gonna unfold like a conventional production type activity.
Yeah, we appreciate that comment, and as Bruce noted, the board had encouraged us to begin the quality management early.
Did you have something to say on that, Bruce? You were kind of waving your hand up there.
I think Steve addressed it. So, yeah.
It's been addressed.
Just an observation, having worked on the board for the last year on the spillway project, I've seen the design team bring in all kinds of experts, like Dr. Hank Falvey, the world's leading expert on cavitation on spillways, and he was brought on the team as needed. Dr. Michael Johnson from Utah State Water Resources Laboratory is doing the physical model studies for the spillway, and his expertise was brought. And then Michael George, I think, to have, you know, the world's expert on scour and bedrock and things like that. So wherever there is a need, my observation has been they found the world's best and the nation's best to work on the project.
So maybe the one thing I would add is I think DWR has brought on some great consultants. Those consultants have a fair amount of experience in risk management and doing the types of risk analysis that need to be done. I think DWR also has available to them a number of resources that have been used by the Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, and others. While they haven't personally perhaps done that, they have people in their core of consultants that they brought on board who have in fact done those kinds and led those kinds of risk assessments. So I think they've got the resources lined up to be able to do what they need to do.
Yeah, an example was we had David Bowles run the potential failure mode, the supplemental PFMA for FERC. So we do have that capability. I should say the department.
And I think I could pledge on behalf of Congressman Moff and some of Gallagher and I, if there be any need of the legislature to intervene to be helpful to DWR on garnering some of these resources, we stand ready to do that for sure. Did you have something, Mike? I thought your hand was up.
Yeah, just a comment. So, I guess for my constituents in the west bank of the Feather River, my only role is just to help communicate from this group what's happening, to control rumors, to set the record straight. And I would just encourage the department, you know, and I was interested in this exchange between Ron on sort of what the scope of work was. And I mean, I had some of those same questions, and that, you know, I think most people in this room, maybe not everybody in this room, recognize that design is a messy, iterative business, and that you are going to make course corrections, you know, all the time. It's messy, and it has nothing to do with the sort of the accelerated time frame, and that's just part of what happens during hardcore, you know, engineering design. But that's really difficult to communicate to the public. They just don't get that. So I would just encourage the department that when you set an expectation, that you're sure you're not going to be revisiting it tomorrow or the next day. And there are some things that matter more significantly to the public, to our public, than other things. And so while you're going through this process of sorting out, you know, if you're going, for example, if you need spillway augmentation or a low-level outlet, that's not something you want to put in, because you know you're going to revisit that. You're going to iterate. You're going to do a risk analysis, and maybe you have to redo something. But there are some things, say, for example, if you're going to say that the emergency spillway, we don't expect it to be used for some recurrence interval. That's important to us. That's important to the folks who evacuated. Something very high level like that would be very easy to explain to the public. And I think to the extent that we could be helpful without getting in your business is to help craft that message that gets out to the public. I concur with a lot of comments that Rune, you had about the risk assessment. And if there are points where you stop, revisit some of the criteria for whatever reason, and they're going to happen, that might be an important threshold or milestone to get folks into the room. You know, the folks who have to communicate this message and understand it, those would be important milestones when you make those important decisions. That's all I have.
Ron, did you have something?
Yeah, and I think, well, I'll just repeat the importance of developing a good matrix for issues. But also, I think one of the issues that the community in particular, and even the ad hoc group, are struggling to understand is what changes to the project have already occurred, and as part of the reconstruction effort, IRB noted the importance of control systems and backup power. Just using that as an example, I suspect that as part of the reconstruction, certainly with the relocation of power lines, but there's been some attention as part of the reconstruction project to redundant and backup control systems and electrical systems to the project. And though the department may consider that all to be hush-hush CEII, if the community and these groups here have questions about, can we avoid all of the drama that we had in 2017, because we've got a lot of resilience in the project. One system goes down, some other system we can rely on, and maybe even a third system. You're going to have to tell us that. Don't just assume that we know all of the things that the reconstruction effort has already accomplished. Assume that if you're surveying where we are today, as opposed to where Bulletin 200 had described the project, it's time for somehow or another the department to be able to communicate what it's done, in addition to what the charge of the CNA is, which is to take a look at potential improvements.
Well, we need to kind of wrap it up, folks. Could we kind of go around any other final comments or observations?
I guess I just want to add to Ron's comments, because I know this is complicated. I mean, the CNA is something, we're doing something that I think hasn't been done before, where a utility is trying to do what we're trying to do, involve the community. So some things we're figuring it out as we go. Some things we've given a lot of thought. So, and I know the stuff that Ron brings up is really important. In my mind, I'm always trying to think, how do we do that? Because this group, I want to keep it charged on the CNA, because the low-lying fruit that we talked about early on, I want to know what that is. I want to know right now, so we can start working on that right now. But at the same time, I understand what Ron's saying. The department's gone through a rehab of the power facility starting 5 years ago. We had like a 15-year plan to update the whole facility, units, the fire systems, everything. And I know that's information that would be good for you guys to know. So my mind, I don't know how yet, Ron. How do we give you that information, but not have it be the focus of this meeting so much that we don't get to the CNA stuff, because they're going to be moving fast. So I just throw that out there that we're thinking about it. I hear you.
Homework. Writing stuff down and giving us the homework, assign the task. We'll read the documents, and that will give us a better sense of where we are today, so that we can give a sense of where we need to go in the future.
Yeah, well, let us think it through. Let us just think it through and see how, but I just wanted to share that, because I know we don't want to keep information. We want you to know everything, but at the same time, this is really important.
John, why don't you kind of give us some closing comments?
Something really great. Sure.
Curtis Grima.
So on the IRB memo, it mentioned that DWR previously studied the possibility of adding a low-level outlet. And it appears that the IRB reviewed that study, which concluded that the risk of constructing a new capacity outweighed the dam safety risk. Is it possible for this ad hoc group to also review that previous study that was done?
A microphone is passed to Ted.
Yeah, if I recall, what was presented to the IRB was a summary of that study. So I think it was pretty high level, and that's something that, we could share, at a high level, how we got to that and why we're reconsidering, the outcome of that.
All right, well, we are definitely 20-some minutes over here, so I do want to conclude our meeting here, but just in closing, I want to say thank you very much for everyone's participation. We hope this has been helpful. We're also really interested in feedback as we're trying to find the right level of material to present, so definitely interested in what you took away from this. We'd like to get questions that the group would like to pose to the IRB and DWR. I'd like to get those in a couple of weeks. Those we'll send to Kearns and West. We'll send an email out with just the process on how to do that. But again, thank you all very much.
And folks, there's a reporter out there wanting some information. My thoughts would be just to offer that all of us have gotten together and started this group that's really historic, going to be very significant in terms of getting everything going right, and not much more than that. Is any other thoughts any of you have of a message to communicate today?
One thing, Senator, is just that public safety
Yes, sir.
is a big, is a primary focus on this, and I think that will go a long way to alleviate the concerns of the community.
Good point, Sheriff. All right, folks, listen, this is, I've been around this a long, long time, and this is very historic and very significant. This will be something we'll be telling our grandkids about. So thank you. We'll look forward to the next one, I think, in October.